Hey everyone, welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content and want to help this video reach more people, go ahead and use your hype points. It really makes a difference and helps us keep bringing you these deep dives into the unknown. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's wild to know some of you are listening at 3 in the morning while others are on your lunch break halfway across the globe. This isn't just another story about little green men and flying saucers. This is about the freight that never delivered, the trucker who saw too much, and the desert that keeps its secrets better than any government ever could. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let's talk about what really happens on the roads leading to the most classified military installation in American history. Area 51, the freight that never delivered the desert frequency. There's a stretch of highway in Nevada that doesn't appear on most GPS systems the way it should. Highway 375 runs through the kind of emptiness that makes you question whether civilization was ever really here at all. They call it the extraterrestrial highway now, a nickname that started as a joke and became official in 1996 when the state put up signs with little UFO symbols. But the truckers who've driven it for decades, the ones who haul freight through the night when the desert temperature drops and the stars spread out like broken glass across black velvet, they call it something else. They call it the frequency. Not because of radio signals, though those are strange enough out here. They call it that because of the hum, the feeling, the sense that something underneath the sand is listening, waiting, broadcasting on a wavelength that human ears weren't designed to detect, but human instincts recognise all the same. Jack Reeves knew that feeling better than most. He was 48 years old in the summer of 2013, a man whose face had been weathered by 2 decades of long-haul trucking through the American Southwest. He had the kind of face that looked older in dim light and younger in the sun, creased around the eyes from squinting at endless roads, stubbled because shaving in truck stop bathrooms was more trouble than it was worth. His hands were thick and calloused, wrapped around a steering wheel more often than not, and he had a voice that carried the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who spent most of his time alone. Jack worked as an independent contractor for a subsidiary of EG&G Special Projects, a company whose name appeared on very few documents, and whose employees signed non-disclosure agreements as thick as phone books. EG&G had serviced Groom Lake Airstrip since the early 80s, back when the base officially didn't exist and the government maintained that the lights people saw in the desert sky were swamp gas or weather balloons, or the planet Venus seen through atmospheric distortion. Jack's job was simple, at least on paper. He picked up freight from Nellis Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, signed for it without asking questions, and delivered it to coordinates that changed depending on the week. Sometimes it was Tonopah Test Range, sometimes it was isolated hangars near Mercury, Nevada. And sometimes, though not often, it was the place that had no name on any map, the place where the roads ended and the fences began, and the signs warned that photography was prohibited and use of deadly force was authorized. He'd been driving these routes since 2008, and in all that time, he'd learned 3 rules that kept him employed and alive. Rule 1, never open the cargo. Rule 2, never talk about the cargo. Rule 3, never ever stop the truck between the checkpoint and the delivery zone. But rules, Jack had learned, were made by people who'd never driven through the desert at 3 in the morning listening to Art Bell reruns on AM radio, hearing the stories about whistleblowers and black projects and things that moved through the sky in ways that physics professors said were impossible. Rules were made by people who'd never felt the hum. The night it all changed started like any other. Act 1. The Contract. August 26th, 2013. The date mattered because 3 months earlier, the CIA had done something unprecedented. They'd released documents, heavily redacted but official, that finally acknowledged what conspiracy theorists had been saying for decades. Area 51 existed. It was real. It had a location, coordinates that placed it at Groom Lake in the Nevada desert, and it had been used since 1955 for classified aircraft testing. The U-2 spy plane had been born there, assembled in secret and tested in skies that civilians were forbidden from entering. Later came the A-12 Oxcart, sleek and black and capable of speeds that seemed like science fiction. Then the SR-71 Blackbird, a plane so advanced that its titanium skin would expand from heat friction at high altitude. A plane that could outrun missiles by simply accelerating. And in the 80s, the F-117 Nighthawk, the first true stealth aircraft, a geometric impossibility that looked like it had been folded from paper by aliens who'd never seen a bird. All of it had happened at Groom Lake. All of it had been hidden behind denials and cover stories, and men with clipboards who wrote classified across every piece of paper that left the base. But in June of 2013, the CIA had finally admitted it. They released a report acknowledging the U-2 program, mentioning Area 51 by name, even including a map with the base's location marked in a small black square. Conspiracy theorists celebrated, skeptics shrugged, and the government said in effect, yes, it exists. Yes, we test secret aircraft there. No, there are no aliens. Jack had been listening to the news reports while driving a load of industrial refrigeration units to Creech Air Force Base. He'd laughed, a short bark of amusement that echoed in his empty cab. Of course, they'd admit to the stuff that was already obsolete. The U-2 had been declassified for years. The Blackbird was in museums. The public could handle hearing about planes from the 60s and 70s. What they wouldn't hear about were the things being tested now, the projects with budget allocations buried in documents labelled miscellaneous procurement and advanced aerospace studies. 2 months after the CIA's admission, Jack got a call from his dispatcher. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, female, not his usual contact. She told him there was a priority hall available, high security clearance required, double the normal pay rate. Pick up at Nellis, delivery to Site U-97. The cargo was listed as avionics hardware, sensitive equipment, standard protocol. Jack had done dozens of hauls like this. He said yes before she had finished explaining the terms. He picked up the truck on a Thursday evening, the sun already sinking behind the spring mountains, turning the desert into shades of copper and rust. The facility at Nellis was a warren of warehouses and hangars, most of them identical, all of them anonymous. A forklift operator loaded a single container into his trailer, a silver box about the size of a small car stencilled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to Jack. He signed the electronic manifest noting that the destination field was blank, except for the site designation, U-97. The paperwork also included a non-disclosure agreement. Jack had signed hundreds of them. This one was different. The logo at the top wasn't EG&G. It was Ecom/URS Federal Services, a company he'd heard of in passing, but never worked with directly. They were contractors, the kind that handled infrastructure for classified sites, the kind whose employees knew how to keep their mouths shut because talking meant prison time under the Espionage Act. He signed. He climbed into his cab. He started the engine and rolled out of Nellis as the first stars appeared overhead. The route took him north on Highway 95, away from the neon glow of Las Vegas, away from the last outpost of civilization. The road was empty. It always was at this hour. Jack settled into the rhythm of driving, hands loose on the wheel, eyes scanning the horizon for the reflective glint of deer or the sudden appearance of jackrabbits. He reached over and clicked on his radio, spinning the dial until he caught the familiar crackle of AM frequency. It was a rebroadcast, one of the classic Art Bell episodes from the late 90s. Jack had heard it before, but it never got old. The voice was calm, hypnotic, the kind of voice that made the impossible sound reasonable. Tonight's episode was a replay from September 11th, 1997, the night a man called in claiming to be a former Area 51 employee. His voice was frantic, panicked. breaking up with static as he described extraterrestrial entities and interdimensional beings and disasters that would wipe out major population centres. Then the line had gone dead. The station satellite feed had cut out, and for the next 30 minutes Coast to Coast AM had been off the air. Jack had always assumed it was a hoax, a performance piece by someone with too much imagination and access to a phone. But listening to it again, alone in his cab with the cargo rattling faintly behind him, he felt the hairs on his arm stand up. The caller's voice had sounded genuinely terrified, and the way the broadcast had been cut off, the way Art Bell himself had sounded confused and unsettled when the show came back online, it all felt too authentic to be staged. The radio crackled. The rebroadcast skipped, static washing over the caller's voice. Jack frowned and reached for the dial, but before he could adjust it, the signal died completely. Just dead air, a hiss of white noise. He glanced at his GPS. The screen was frozen, the little arrow marking his position locked in place even though he was still moving. He tapped it. Nothing. The screen flickered once, then went black. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel. He told himself it was nothing. Electronics failed out here all the time. The military ran jamming tests, radar experiments, God knew what else. His GPS would reboot in a minute. The radio would find another station. He kept driving. Act 2. History on the radio. The desert outside Jack's windshield was a study in monotone, a landscape that looked the same mile after mile. Scrub brush and sand and distant mountains that never seemed to get closer. Above him, the Milky Way was a river of light, so bright that he could see his own shadow on the dashboard. No moon tonight, just stars and silence. And then the radio came back. Not the rebroadcast, not Art Bell. This was something else, a voice that sounded like it was being played from an old reel-to-reel tape, the kind of audio quality you'd hear in a documentary from the 50s. Formal, clipped. The accent was mid-Atlantic, the kind of voice that belonged to newscasters and military spokesmen from an era when people still trusted the government. In 1955, the voice said, the Central Intelligence Agency approved the construction of a covert testing facility in the Nevada desert. The location was chosen for its remoteness, its proximity to existing military infrastructure, and its position beneath restricted airspace. The site, known internally as Groom Lake, would become the birthplace of America's most advanced reconnaissance aircraft. Jack blinked. He hadn't changed the station. He hadn't touched the dial. But somehow his radio had tuned itself to what sounded like a history lecture. The voice continued. The U-2 spy plane, designed by Lockheed's Skunk Works division, under the direction of Clarence Johnson, was first tested at Groom Lake in August of 1955. The aircraft was capable of flying at altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet, far above the range of Soviet radar and interceptor aircraft. Pilots reported that at such heights, the sky above them was not blue but black, and the curvature of the earth was visible on the horizon. Jack found himself listening despite the strangeness of it. He'd always been interested in aviation history, the engineering marvels that had emerged from the Cold War's desperate race for technological supremacy. The U-2 had been a masterpiece of design, a glider with a jet engine, so light and fragile that it could barely land without its wings scraping the runway. In 1962, the voice went on, the CIA initiated Project Oxcart, the development of a successor to the U-2. The resulting aircraft, designated a 12, was capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3 and altitudes of 90,000 feet. Its titanium fuselage could withstand temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit, the result of air friction at hypersonic velocities. Test pilots described the experience as riding a controlled explosion. The radio crackled again. The voice distorted, words stretching and compressing. Jack reached over to adjust the tuning knob, and his hand froze. The voice had changed. It was still formal, still calm, but now it was reading something else, something that sounded like a classified document. Memo to Director of Central Intelligence Alan Dulles. dated April 9th, 1958. Subject: Justification for continued secrecy, Groom Lake operations. The following rationale is provided to support ongoing denial of base existence in public discourse. First, acknowledgement of site location would compromise operational security for aircraft in development. Second, civilian speculation regarding unidentified aerial phenomena observed near restricted zones provides effective cover for test flights of experimental craft. Third, maintenance of ambiguity permits controlled disclosure on timeline determined by national security interests. Jack's throat felt dry. He wasn't sure what he was hearing, but it didn't sound like a radio program. It sounded like someone had taken actual government documents and set them to audio, reading them aloud in a voice that had no emotion, no inflection, just facts delivered in the cadence of bureaucracy. The voice skipped again, static washing over it like waves. When it came back, it was talking about the 70s. Project Have Blue, initiated in 1976, sought to develop an aircraft with minimal radar cross-section. The resulting prototype, tested at Groom Lake beginning in December of 1977, utilised faceted surfaces to deflect radar energy away from transmitting sources. Pilots reported that ground controllers could not track the aircraft visually or electronically at distances exceeding 5 miles, despite clear atmospheric conditions. Jack thought about the implications of that. A plane that was invisible to radar. A plane that looked, to any observer, like it simply wasn't there. He thought about all the UFO sightings that had been reported near Area 51 over the decades, the lights that moved in impossible ways, the craft that accelerated from a standstill to supersonic speeds without producing a sonic boom. How many of those sightings had been experimental aircraft? How many had been deliberate tests to see how people would react to something they couldn't explain? And how many, Jack wondered, had been something else entirely? The radio hissed again. This time when the voice returned, it was reading from something that sounded less like a memo and more like a testimony. Deposition of former Groom Lake contractor Richard Martinez, dated March 3rd, 1994. Mr. Martinez alleges exposure to toxic materials during waste incineration operations conducted at the facility between 1988 and 1991. Symptoms reported include respiratory distress, skin lesions, and neurological impairment. Request for compensation filed under Federal Tort Claims Act. Request denied on grounds that location of alleged exposure remains classified and cannot be confirmed for legal proceedings. Jack had heard about the lawsuits. In the mid-90s, a group of contractors and their families had sued the federal government, claiming that the Air Force had burned barrels of hazardous waste in open pits at Area 51, that the workers had been exposed to carcinogens and radioactive materials, and that several of them had died as a result. The government's response had been to invoke state secrets privilege, to say that even acknowledging the existence of the base would compromise national security. The case had been dismissed. The workers got nothing. The voice on the radio shifted again, and now it was talking about something Jack had never heard of. Project Sigma, Continuity Operations, memorandum dated August 19th, 1974. Authorization granted for establishment of subterranean research facility adjacent to primary testing areas. Purpose: analysis of recovered materials and biological specimens under controlled environmental conditions. Personnel assigned to Sigma operations are to maintain absolute compartmentalization. Disclosure of project details to unauthorized individuals, including other facility personnel, will result in immediate termination of employment and prosecution under relevant statutes. Jack's hands were slick on the steering wheel. Recovered materials, biological specimens. The voice was talking about things that sounded like they'd been pulled directly from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. But the tone was so matter-of-fact, so clinical, that it was impossible to dismiss as fiction. He glanced at the GPS again. Still dead. He tried his cell phone. No signal. Not even the little indicator that showed he was searching for a tower. just blank, as if the phone had forgotten what a cellular network was. The radio continued. The voice read memo after memo, document after document, each one describing projects and operations that sounded progressively more bizarre. References to trans-medium propulsion systems, mentions of non-terrestrial artifacts, a passage about biological entities exhibiting characteristics inconsistent with known evolutionary taxonomy. Jack reached over and turned the radio off. The voice kept talking. He stared at the dashboard. The radio's power light was off. The display was dark. But the voice continued, emanating from the speakers like it was coming from somewhere deeper than the wiring, like the sound itself had been embedded in the truck. Jack yanked the keys out of the ignition. The engine died. The headlights went dark. The truck coasted forward in silence, momentum carrying it down the highway. And still, faintly, he could hear the voice, now distorted beyond comprehension, words blending into a low hum that resonated in his chest. Then it stopped. The desert was silent. No wind, no insects. Just the sound of his own breathing and the faint tick of the cooling engine. Jack sat in the darkness for a long moment. Then he turned the key. The engine roared back to life. The headlights blazed, illuminating the empty road ahead. The radio stayed off. He drove in silence for the next hour, his mind racing, trying to rationalize what he'd just heard. Radio interference. A bizarre prank. Something to do with the cargo he was hauling. There had to be an explanation. He didn't believe any of them. Act 3. The checkpoint. Jack reached the perimeter checkpoint at 2:17 in the morning. He knew the time because he'd been watching the clock on his dashboard obsessively since the radio incident, grounding himself in the concrete reality of numbers and minutes passing. The checkpoint was a low structure of concrete and reinforced glass, floodlit by sodium vapour lamps that turned the surrounding desert into a stage set, all harsh light and deep shadow. 2 guards stepped out as Jack rolled to a stop. They wore fatigues with no insignia, no name tags, no unit patches. Their rifles were slung across their chests, not aimed but visible. One of them approached the driver's side window while the other circled the truck, a flashlight playing over the trailer's exterior. Jack rolled down the window. The guard held out a gloved hand without saying a word. Jack passed over his ID and the manifest. The guard scanned both with a handheld device, then looked up at Jack's face, comparing it to whatever photo was on file. After a moment, the guard handed the documents back. "Park at the red light," the guard said. His voice was flat, uninflected. "Leave the engine running. Do not exit the vehicle. We'll handle the offload." Jack nodded. He'd done this before, though never at this particular checkpoint. He put the truck in gear and rolled forward, following the painted yellow line on the pavement to a spot marked by a single red traffic signal mounted on a pole. The light wasn't connected to anything. It just stood there, glowing crimson against the darkness. He put the truck in neutral, engaged the parking brake and waited. Through his side mirror, he watched the guards move to the back of the trailer. They worked in silence, their movements efficient and practiced. A motorized pallet jack appeared, rolling out from somewhere beyond the floodlights. The trailer's rear door opened with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty desert. Jack reached for his dash cam. It was a cheap unit he'd installed himself, mounted on the windshield with a suction cup, recording everything through the front window in case of accidents or disputes about delivery times. The little red recording light was always on when the truck was running, except now it wasn't. Jack tapped the camera. The screen remained dark. He pressed the power button. Nothing. He traced the power cable down to where it plugged into the cigarette lighter. The connection was secure, but the camera was dead, as if someone had reached into the electronics and flipped a switch. A sound made him look up. Through the windshield he saw the guards rolling the silver container off his trailer. In the harsh floodlights, he could make out the stenciling on its side more clearly than he had at Nellis. The alphanumeric codes meant nothing to him, but below them, in smaller letters, was a phrase. Youssef Property. 1951 Recovery Unit. 1951. 4 years before Area 51 officially existed. 4 years after Roswell. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears. He watched the guards maneuver the container onto a flatbed truck that had appeared silently from the darkness. They secured it with straps, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of repetition. How many times had they done this? How many containers had passed through this checkpoint bearing dates and labels that shouldn't exist? As the guards worked, Jack became aware of another sound. At first he thought it was the wind, but the air outside was perfectly still, the scrub brush motionless. The sound was deeper than wind, a low-frequency vibration that he felt more than heard, something that resonated in his bones and made his teeth ache. He'd heard this sound before. Every trucker who'd driven these routes had heard it at some point. The hum, the frequency. It was coming from somewhere beyond the checkpoint, out in the darkness where the floodlights couldn't reach. Jack strained his eyes, trying to see anything in that vast emptiness, but the contrast between the lights and the darkness was too extreme. He could have been staring at a wall 10 feet away or the horizon 20 miles distant. The hum grew louder, not by much, but enough that Jack could feel it in the steering wheel, a vibration that travelled up through his hands and into his chest. His vision began to swim slightly, the edges of objects blurring as if his eyes were having trouble focusing. One of the guards walked back to Jack's window. He made a sharp gesture. Leave. Now. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He released the parking brake, put the truck in gear and started to roll forward. But instead of following the road back the way he'd come, toward the checkpoint gate and the highway beyond, he found himself turning onto a different route, following yellow lights that stretched ahead into the darkness. "Wait," Jack said aloud to himself, to the empty cab. "This isn't right." But his hands kept turning the wheel. His foot stayed on the accelerator. The truck followed the lights deeper into the restricted zone, past barriers and warning signs that Jack's conscious mind screamed at him to obey. The hum was inside his skull now, a pressure that made thinking difficult. The yellow lights seemed to pulse in rhythm with it, guiding him forward like a runway. Jack tried to stop, tried to hit the brakes, but his body wasn't responding to his intentions. He was a passenger in his own flesh, watching helplessly as the truck carried him towards something his rational mind insisted could not exist. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the hum stopped. Jack's hands jerked on the wheel. The truck swerved, tyres crunching on gravel. He slammed the brakes, and the entire rig shuddered to a halt, trailer fishtailing slightly before settling. He sat there, breathing hard, his heart hammering so fast he thought he might be having a cardiac episode. Slowly, his hands trembling, he looked around. He was in the middle of the desert. No checkpoint, no guards, no yellow lights, just endless scrubland stretching away in all directions under a sky so packed with stars that it looked like someone had shattered a window into heaven. And directly ahead of him, perhaps 200 yards distant, was a structure. It wasn't a hangar. It wasn't a building. It was an opening in the ground, a ramp descending into the earth at a gentle angle, wide enough to drive a semi-truck down. The edges were smooth, too smooth to be natural, and they seemed to catch the starlight in a way that made them shimmer like oil on water. Jack put the truck in reverse. The transmission clunked. The engine revved. The wheels spun. He wasn't moving. The truck was stuck, or held, or something he didn't have words for. He tried the radio. Dead. He tried his phone. No signal. He tried the CB, flipping through channels, hoping to raise anyone, but all he got was static. The hum started again, softer this time, almost gentle, and with it came a sound he recognised. Footsteps on gravel, approaching from behind. Jack looked in his side mirror. There was nothing there. The footsteps came closer, slow, measured, the sound of boots on loose stone. Jack's hand moved to the door handle. He told himself not to open it, not to step out into the desert night where things moved in ways that couldn't be explained. But his hand was already pulling the handle, already pushing the door open, and he was climbing down from the cab, his legs moving automatically. He turned around. The desert was empty. No guards, no vehicles, nothing but sand and stars and the distant mountains. The footsteps stopped. Jack heard breathing, not his own, slower, deeper, rhythmic, like a machine. "Who's there?" he said. His voice sounded small and ridiculous in the enormous silence. No answer. Just the breathing, and beneath it, the hum. Jack looked back at the ramp descending into the earth. At the mouth of the tunnel, he could now see lettering carved into the stone, faded but legible. Project Sigma Continuity. He'd heard that name on the radio, on the broadcast that shouldn't have been playing. The voice had mentioned it, casually, as if it were just another item in a long list of classified programs. Recovered materials, biological specimens, continuity operations. Jack walked toward the ramp. He told himself to stop, to get back in the truck, to turn around and drive away even if it meant abandoning the rig and walking back to civilization on foot. But his legs kept moving, carrying him forward with a will independent of his own. The ramp's surface was strange under his boots. It looked like stone, but it felt like metal, smooth and slightly warm to the touch. The walls on either side were the same, vitrified into glass like surfaces that reflected his flashlight beam in fragmented patterns. This wasn't excavated. This was burned into the earth, carved by heat so intense that it had fused sand into something crystalline and permanent. Jack descended into the tunnel, his flashlight cutting weak angles through the darkness ahead. The hum grew louder the deeper he went, filling his ears until he couldn't hear his own footsteps anymore. The air smelled wrong, metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. The tunnel opened into a chamber. Jack stopped at the threshold, his light playing across a space that was vast and empty and utterly wrong. The walls curved in ways that hurt to look at, surfaces that seemed to bend perspective so that distances became impossible to judge. The floor was smooth and reflective like obsidian, and in its surface Jack could see lights moving beneath him, circuits or pathways that glowed with a faint blue luminescence. In the centre of the chamber was a pit. Jack approached it slowly, each step an act of will against every instinct screaming at him to run. The pit was circular, perhaps 50 feet across, its edges perfectly smooth. And from its depths came the hum, louder now, a sound that made Jack's vision blur and his stomach lurch. He reached the edge and looked down. The pit descended farther than his flashlight could reach, a shaft dropping into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the beam. But there was something moving down there, something that reflected light in patterns that shifted and changed, surfaces that appeared and disappeared like images glimpsed through running water. Jack stepped back from the edge. His boot scraped against something metallic. He looked down and saw a panel set flush with the floor, covered in symbols that weren't letters or numbers but something in between, geometric shapes that his mind tried and failed to organise into meaning. He touched the panel. The hum surged, sudden and overwhelming, and Jack's vision went white. When it cleared, he was somewhere else, not the chamber, not the tunnel. He was standing in a room that looked like a control centre, walls lined with screens and consoles, everything dark except for a single monitor glowing with green phosphorescent text. The text scrolled past too fast to read, lines of data or code or something that looked like language but followed no grammar Jack recognised. And then he heard the voice, not from the radio this time, not from speakers or hidden devices. It came from inside his head, a sound that bypassed his ears entirely and resonated directly in his consciousness. Witness, it said, not a command, a statement, a designation. Jack tried to speak, but his throat wouldn't work. He tried to move, but his body was frozen, locked in place like a statue. The voice continued. Records indicate observation of unauthorized intrusion. Standing protocols require containment and processing. However, current directives prioritize non-intervention in civilian exposure events. You will be returned to perimeter. Memory suppression will be partial to allow for documentation and dissemination through unofficial channels. This serves continuity objectives. Jack's vision blurred again. The room dissolved into static white noise that filled his senses completely. Act 4. The Files and the Fire. When Jack woke up, he was in his truck. The engine was running. The dashboard clock read 4:53 in the morning. He was parked at a rest stop outside Alamo, Nevada, 40 miles from the checkpoint, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. His head pounded. His mouth tasted like copper. Every muscle in his body ached as if he'd been working manual labour for hours. He sat up slowly, checking himself for injuries. Nothing. No cuts, no bruises, no signs of trauma. His clothes were dusty, his boots caked with fine sand, but otherwise he was intact. The trailer was empty. The cargo was gone, delivered or disappeared. Jack didn't know which. He started driving. Not back toward Las Vegas, not toward his dispatcher's office to file a delivery report. He drove to Rachel, Nevada, to the Little Alien, the roadside, a diner that had become a pilgrimage site for UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists. It was the only place Jack could think to go where people might believe what he'd experienced, or at least not call the police when he tried to explain it. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, just a handful of tourists sleeping in their cars outside, and one waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a name tag that read, Margaret. Jack sat at the counter and ordered coffee. When Margaret brought it, he asked if anyone had ever talked to her about working at the base. Margaret smiled, a knowing expression that suggested she'd heard this question 1,000 times. "Everyone talks," she said. "The question is who's telling the truth and who's just repeating what they heard online." "What if someone saw something?" Jack asked. "Something they can't explain?" Margaret poured herself a coffee and leaned against the counter. "Then they'd better be ready for people to call them crazy, or a liar, or a government disinformation agent. That's how it works out here. You see something real, and suddenly you're the problem, not what you saw." She gestured to the walls around them. Jack looked up and realised the entire diner was covered in photographs and newspaper clippings. Images of the base from the 50s, aerial shots showing runways and hangars, articles about the workers' lawsuits in '94, the contractors who'd been exposed to toxic waste and denied compensation. Satellite photos from recent years showing new construction, massive hangars that hadn't existed a decade earlier. One photograph caught Jack's eye. It was a surveillance shot clearly taken from a distance, showing a line of white buses parked outside a terminal. The buses had no markings, no logos, just blank white exteriors that reflected the desert sun. "Janet flights," Margaret said, following his gaze. "That's what they call them. White buses and unmarked planes that ferry workers to the base every day. Nobody knows who those people are or what they do. They sign NDAs that would make your eyes water, and every single one of them has a story about something weird happening out there. Most of them never tell it." Jack sipped his coffee. It was terrible, burnt and bitter, but it was real. It grounded him. "You hear about the new construction?" Margaret asked. She pulled out her phone, swiping through images until she found what she was looking for. She turned the screen toward Jack. It was a satellite image, dated April 20th, 2023. The photo showed Groom Lake from above, the runways and hangars clearly visible. But there was something new in the frame, a cluster of structures that hadn't been there in previous images. The buildings were massive, hangar-sized, and their roofs were covered in what looked like heat dispersion panels. "Someone ran thermal analysis on these," Margaret said. "The readings don't make sense. These buildings are generating heat signatures consistent with industrial fusion reactions. That's not airplane testing. That's power generation on a scale that shouldn't exist with current technology." Jack stared at the image. He thought about the pit, the chamber beneath the desert, the hum that had resonated in his bones. "How many people know about this?" he asked. Margaret shrugged. "Couple thousand saw it online. A few scientists commented. Then the website went down and the images got scrubbed from most of the platforms. But the internet remembers everything. You just have to know where to look." Jack spent the next week compiling everything he could find. He bought a laptop at a big box store in Las Vegas, paying cash, using a VPN to browse forums and declassified document archives. He downloaded reports from the CIA's own website, documents released under Freedom of Information Act requests, heavily redacted but still revealing. There were memos about the U-2 program, justifications for maintaining secrecy even after the aircraft was retired. There were reports about Oxcart and Have Blue and a dozen other programs with innocuous names that masked their true purpose. And buried in the footnotes and appendices were references to things that had no explanations. Anomalous radar returns, objects tracked at velocities exceeding Mach 20, incidents where test pilots reported encounters with craft that matched no known profile. Jack started recording audio journals, talking through what he'd experienced, trying to make sense of it. He mixed his own recollections with passages from declassified documents, creating a narrative that grounded the impossible in bureaucratic language. Memo dated March 8th, 1968, he recorded. Subject: unidentified aerial phenomena observed during Oxcart test flight. Pilot reports object pacing aircraft at Mach 3.2, maintaining fixed distance of approximately 500 feet. Object described as spherical, reflective, approximately 30 feet in diameter. No propulsion signature detected. Object accelerated vertically and disappeared from radar tracking at altitude exceeding 100,000 feet. Incident classified under Project Silverbug protocols. He didn't know if anyone would ever hear these recordings. He didn't know if they mattered, but the act of creating them, of turning his experience into words and data, helped him feel like he wasn't losing his mind. Act 5. The Night Run. 6 years passed. Jack kept driving, kept hauling freight through the desert, though never again for EG&G or any of their subsidiaries. He avoided the routes near Groom Lake. He stopped listening to Coast AM. He tried to forget. But in July of 2019, his dispatcher called with an offer he couldn't refuse. Another high-security haul, same route, triple pay. Jack should have said no. Every instinct told him to say no. But he'd been struggling financially, the trucking industry contracting as shipping companies consolidated routes, and the money was enough to keep him afloat for 6 months. He said yes. This was during the summer of the Storm Area 51 event, the viral Facebook joke that had somehow turned into a real movement. Millions of people had pledged to see them aliens, to gather at the gates of the base on September 20th and force their way inside. The military had issued warnings. The local sheriff had held press conferences begging people not to come, but the internet didn't care about warnings. Jack picked up the truck on July 18th. The cargo manifest was blank this time, just a weight notation, 12,000 pounds. When he asked what he was hauling, the loading supervisor told him it was equipment for emergency response preparation. Nothing more. Jack drove north through the night. The highway was busier than usual. Caravans of RVs and passenger cars heading toward Rachel. Tourists and true believers making the pilgrimage to see the most famous classified base in America. Jack passed them slowly, his rig lumbering through the darkness, while cars honked and passengers waved. Some holding up signs that read, "We believe and show us the aliens." Around midnight, Jack's radio cut to an emergency broadcast frequency. The voice was automated, repeating the same message on a loop. "Attention, you're approaching restricted military airspace. Unauthorized entry is prohibited under federal law. Use of deadly force is authorized. Turn back now." Jack had heard this broadcast before on previous runs, but tonight it was different. Beneath the automated voice, he could hear other sounds, fragments of conversation bleeding through from another frequency, voices discussing coordinates, someone saying, "Containment protocol active," another voice, calmer, repeating numbers that Jack recognised as GPS coordinates near Groom Lake. He tried to change the station. The radio wouldn't respond. The broadcast continued, overlapping voices creating a chaotic stream of information that Jack's mind struggled to parse. And then, cutting through everything else, he heard a single word repeated 3 times. Sigma. The same name from the tunnel. The same designation carved into stone. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel. He checked his mirrors. The highway behind him was empty now, the tourist traffic falling away as he approached the restricted zone. Ahead, the checkpoint loomed, but something was wrong. The guard station was dark. No floodlights. No vehicles. Jack slowed to a crawl, his headlights cutting across the empty checkpoint. The barrier gate was raised, locked in the open position. The guard station's windows were dark, no signs of life. He should have turned around, should have driven back to Vegas and told his dispatcher the delivery was impossible. But something pulled him forward. The same compulsion he'd felt 6 years earlier. He sensed that this was inevitable, that he'd been on a trajectory toward this moment since the night he'd first heard the hum. Jack drove through the checkpoint. No one stopped him. No alarm sounded. He followed the road deeper into the restricted zone, and ahead of him, pulsing in the darkness like a beacon, he saw the red light. The same red light from before, mounted on its pole glowing crimson against the starless sky. Jack stopped the truck beneath it and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The desert was silent. No hum, no voices, just the tick of the cooling engine and Jack's own breathing. Then the light changed from red to yellow, then to green. Jack looked at the road ahead. The pavement stretched away into darkness, but there were no other lights, no guide markers, just the green signal, permission or command, and the vast emptiness beyond. Jack put the truck in gear and drove forward, following the road until it wasn't a road anymore, until he was driving across open desert, his headlights illuminating nothing but sand and scrub. He drove until he saw it ahead, rising from the ground like a wound in the earth. The ramp, the tunnel, the entrance to something that shouldn't exist. Jack stopped the truck. He turned off the engine. In the sudden silence he could hear his heart pounding, could feel the blood moving through his veins like electricity. He climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on sand. The air was cold, colder than it should be in the middle of summer, and there was a smell on the wind like metal and ozone. Jack walked to the ramp's entrance. The lettering was still there, carved into stone that gleamed like glass. Project Sigma. Continuity. He descended into the tunnel. His flashlight was dead, but he didn't need it. The walls glowed with that same faint blue luminescence, enough to see by, enough to navigate. The hum was back, softer than before, a vibration that felt almost welcoming. The tunnel opened into the chamber. Jack stepped through, and his breath caught. The pit was no longer empty. Something rested at its bottom, something that caught the light and bent it. Surfaces shifting through colours that Jack had no names for. It was massive, easily the size of a house, and it was moving, rotating slowly on an axis that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. As Jack watched, the object began to rise. It moved in complete silence, no engines, no propulsion system visible. It simply lifted, defying gravity with the casualness of a balloon released into the wind. The surfaces reflected the chamber's blue light, casting patterns across the walls that looked like language, like diagrams, like star charts from a perspective no human had ever seen. Jack pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. He raised it, framing the rising object in the camera, and pressed record. The screen went white. The phone died in his hand, all its electronics fried by something Jack couldn't perceive. The object continued to rise, reaching the level of the chamber floor, then moving past him toward the tunnel entrance. Jack turned to watch it go. This impossible thing gliding up the ramp and out into the desert night. He followed it. When Jack emerged from the tunnel, the object was hovering above the desert floor, perhaps 50 feet up, rotating slowly. It cast no shadow despite the starlight. It made no sound, and then it moved. Not gradually, not with acceleration. It simply changed position, from hovering above the desert to being a mile away in an instant, a transition that Jack's eyes couldn't track, because it happened between frames of perception. The object disappeared into the southern sky, a point of light that faded to nothing. Jack stood in the desert for a long time after it was gone. Eventually he walked back to his truck, climbed into the cab and started the engine. His CB radio crackled to life. Jack grabbed the mic out of habit, keying it. "Tell Art Bell he was right," Jack said into the static. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, the voice of a man reporting something he had witnessed on the road. "Tell him they're real, and they've been here the whole time." He released the mic. The static continued for a moment, then resolved into silence. Jack drove. Act 6. Aftermath. They found Jack's truck 3 days later, parked at mile marker 23 on Highway 95, engine running, all lights on. The driver's door was open, the keys were in the ignition. The CB radio was still recording, 68 hours of continuous static. Jack Reeves was never found. The official investigation concluded that he'd experienced a mental health crisis and wandered into the desert, where he likely succumbed to dehydration or exposure. Search and rescue teams combed the area for weeks, using helicopters and heat-sensing equipment, but found no trace. His truck was impounded. The cargo it had been carrying, whatever it was, had vanished. The manifest showed a delivery to Site U-97, but when investigators followed up, they were told no such site designation existed, and no delivery had been scheduled for that date. The audio recordings Jack had made, the journals and compiled documents, were found on his laptop at his apartment in Las Vegas. His sister listened to them once, then deleted them. She didn't want to believe her brother had been losing his mind. She didn't want the recordings to exist as evidence of his decline, but someone had already uploaded them. Before the laptop was erased, someone had copied the files and posted them to a forum dedicated to Area 51 research. The posts were deleted within hours, but by then they'd been downloaded by hundreds of people, mirrored across dozens of sites. Jack's story became one more thread in the endless tapestry of conspiracy theories surrounding the base. Some people believed it, most didn't. A few claimed they'd had similar experiences, that they'd heard the hum or seen the lights or been pulled into situations they couldn't explain. None of it could be verified. None of it was proven. But in June of 2023, 4 years after Jack's disappearance, commercial satellite imagery of Groom Lake revealed something new. A scar in the desert floor, roughly 600 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, the sand fused into glass. The heat required to create that kind of vitrification was estimated at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. No known aircraft or weapon system could generate that kind of focused thermal energy. The government offered no explanation. When journalists asked about the scar, Air Force spokespeople repeated the standard line: "We don't discuss operations at testing facilities." The scar is still there, visible in satellite images for anyone with an internet connection to see. It sits in the desert like a punctuation mark, the period at the end of a sentence that was never finished. Ending. The desert still breathes. Area 51 began as a runway for spy planes. The U-2, the Oxcart, the Blackbird, aircraft so advanced they seemed like science fiction, even to the pilots who flew them. Later came stealth technology, drones, hypersonic vehicles, each generation pushing further into realms that most people assumed were impossible. But maybe, just maybe, Some of what they were testing out there wasn't built in Lockheed's Skunk Works or Northrop's Black Projects division. Maybe some of it was recovered, studied, reverse engineered from something that came from somewhere else. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe Area 51 is exactly what the government says it is. A test facility for classified aircraft, nothing more. Maybe all the lights in the sky are ours. All the strange radar returns are experimental craft. All the stories are just that. Stories told by people who saw something they couldn't explain and filled in the gaps with their imaginations. But if that's true, then why the secrecy that persists decades after the Cold War ended? Why the lawsuits that get dismissed on national security grounds? Why the satellite photos showing construction that doesn't match any known industrial purpose? Why the scar in the desert fused into glass by heat that shouldn't exist? Jack Reeves drove freight through the Nevada desert for over a decade. He was a reliable contractor, a man who followed rules and kept his mouth shut. Until the night he didn't come home, until the night he left his truck running on an empty highway and walked into the darkness. They say the desert keeps its secrets, that the sand and the wind erase everything eventually, grinding down evidence and memory until nothing remains but stories. But the desert isn't empty. It's full of things we built and things we found and things we still don't understand. And somewhere out there, beneath runways and hangars and tunnels that don't appear on any map, something is still humming, still waiting, still watching the skies for signals we can't interpret and responding in ways we're not equipped to comprehend. Area 51 is real. The documents prove it. The satellites show it. The history confirms it. What happens inside is another question. And maybe, just maybe, the answer is something we're not ready to hear. Area 51 remains an active United States Air Force operating location. Public access is prohibited. No evidence of extraterrestrial technology has ever been officially released. The lights over Groom Lake continue to appear, the hum continues to resonate, and somewhere in the desert beneath the stars the frequency still broadcasts. For those who know how to listen. What if I told you that buried beneath the frozen wastelands of Alaska lies something that could change everything we know about human history? Something that's not ancient at all, but very much alive. Tonight's story comes from a request by Mitul Patel 9283. Thank you for this incredible suggestion. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. And if you enjoy these tales that blur the line between fact and fiction, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more mysterious stories that will keep you wondering. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I found beneath 200 feet of Alaskan permafrost, and why the government wants me to forget it ever existed. I'm a civil engineer, nothing glamorous about it. I measure soil density, calculate load-bearing capacities, and make sure buildings don't sink into the ground. For 15 years, I've worked contracts across the country, from Florida swamplands to Nevada deserts. Alaska was supposed to be just another job. The US Army Corps of Engineers hired me in March 2023 to survey land stability for a proposed pipeline route. Nothing unusual there. Energy companies are always looking to move oil from point A to point B, and they need someone to tell them their pipes won't crack when the ground shifts. The pay was good, the timeline was reasonable, and I needed the work. The assignment took me to a stretch of wilderness about 60 miles northwest of Fairbanks. On paper, it looked simple, a 3-month survey of geological stability across a 40-mile corridor. I'd use ground-penetrating radar, seismographs and core samples to map what lay beneath the surface. Standard procedure. I should have known something was off when they gave me a satellite phone with specific instructions to check in every 12 hours. Weather can change fast up there, the project coordinator explained. We need to know you're alive. But Alaska's a dangerous place. People disappear into the wilderness all the time. It seemed reasonable. I flew into Fairbanks on a Tuesday in April, rented a heavy-duty pickup truck and loaded it with equipment. The drive to my assigned sector took 3 hours on increasingly rough roads. The last 20 miles were barely more than frozen tyre tracks cutting through endless stands of black spruce and birch. When I finally reached my starting coordinates, the silence was absolute. No wind, no animals, no aircraft overhead. Just me, my equipment, and thousands of square miles of nothing. That's when the work began, and that's when everything I thought I knew about the world started to unravel. The first week went exactly as planned. I established a base camp with a generator-powered trailer and methodically began surveying the proposed pipeline route. The ground-penetrating radar showed typical permafrost patterns, layers of ice and soil that had been frozen for millennia. My seismograph readings were clean, showing the kind of stable bedrock that pipeline engineers love to see. Core samples revealed nothing unusual. Standard Arctic soil composition with good load-bearing characteristics. I was making excellent progress. Then, on day 8, something changed. I was setting up the radar array for the morning survey when I noticed interference patterns on my display. Instead of the usual chaotic scattering that indicates rock and soil, I was seeing geometric shapes. At first I assumed it was equipment malfunction. Electronic devices can act strangely in extreme cold, and I'd been pushing my gear hard. I recalibrated the radar, replaced cables, and ran diagnostic tests. Everything checked out perfectly, but the shapes remained straight lines, perfect 90-degree angles, and beneath everything a massive triangular form with sides that extended beyond my radar's maximum penetration depth of 200 feet. I switched to the seismograph, thinking maybe sound waves would give me different data. I set off small explosive charges and measured how the shock waves travelled through the ground. Standard geological surveying technique. The results made no sense. Sound waves were reflecting off something solid and geometrically perfect about 150 feet down. The reflection pattern showed clean edges, flat surfaces, and precise angles. In nature, you don't find precise angles. Rivers meander, mountains erode into curves, and rock formations crack in random patterns. This was something else entirely. I spent the rest of that day running every test I could think of. Different frequencies, multiple angles, overlapping surveys. Every single measurement confirmed the same impossible truth. There was a massive pyramid buried beneath the permafrost, and it was huge. My calculation suggested sides at least 800 feet long, significantly larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The depth readings indicated it was sitting on bedrock, which meant it had been built on the surface and then buried by millions of years of geological processes. Except that made no sense either. Alaska's geological history doesn't include ancient civilizations capable of megalithic construction. The entire region was under glacial ice, until relatively recently in geological terms. I sat in my trailer that night staring at the printouts and digital displays, trying to find any explanation that didn't challenge everything I understood about engineering and archaeology. Maybe it was a natural formation that just happened to look geometric. Maybe my instruments were picking up interference from buried metal or deposits. Maybe the extreme cold was affecting my equipment in ways I didn't understand. But deep down I knew I was looking at something artificial, something that had been deliberately constructed and then hidden beneath the ice. The question was, who built it, and why? I needed supplies, and more importantly, I needed to talk to someone who knew the area's history. The nearest settlement was a village called Yukon Crossing. Population 127 according to the road sign. It was a 40-minute drive south on a road that tested every shock absorber in my truck. Yukon Crossing looked like a lot of rural Alaskan towns. A handful of weathered buildings clustered around a general store and a combination post office-does-gas station. Most of the residents lived in trailer homes or log cabins scattered among the trees. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin grey columns against the bright spring sky. The general store served as the unofficial community centre. Inside, I found an elderly native Alaskan man named Joseph Kaltag behind the counter, selling everything from canned goods to ammunition to fishing gear. He looked like he'd been running the place for decades. "You're the pipeline engineer," he said before I could introduce myself. It wasn't a question. "Word travels fast," I replied. "Not much happens around here." He rang up my purchases: batteries, fuel canisters, and enough food to last another week. "You working up in the Forbidden Valley?" I looked up from counting cash. Forbidden Valley? Joseph's weathered face remained expressionless, but I caught something in his eyes. Concern, maybe, or warning. That's what my grandfather called it. Said the spirits there were angry, animals won't go near it, and hunters who get too close. He shrugged. "Their compasses don't work right." "Magnetic interference," I said automatically. "Probably iron ore deposits in the bedrock. Maybe," he handed me my change, "or maybe some things are better left buried." I was loading supplies into my truck when a younger native woman approached. She introduced herself as Marie Kaltag, Joseph's granddaughter, and a pilot who flew supply runs to remote camps throughout the region. "I heard you talking to Grandpa," she said, "about the valley where you're working." He mentioned compass problems. Marie glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "It's more than that. I've flown over that area maybe 50 times in the last 10 years. My instruments go crazy. GPS cuts out, radio gets static, engine RPMs fluctuate." "Electromagnetic interference," I suggested. That's what I thought too. But 3 years ago I was flying a supply run to a hunting camp about 20 miles north of your work site. Clear day, perfect visibility. I was following the river when my GPS started spinning. Compass needle was rotating like a clock hand. She paused, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. I looked down to try to navigate by landmarks, and I saw something that shouldn't have been there. Lines in the snow, geometric patterns like someone had carved designs into the landscape. They were huge, maybe a mile across and perfectly symmetrical. Could have been natural formations, wind patterns, erosion channels. Marie shook her head. "I've been flying over Alaska my whole life. I know what natural looks like. This was artificial. And when I flew back over the same area a week later, the lines were gone, covered by fresh snow." I thanked her for the information and headed back to camp, but I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Geometric patterns in the snow, electromagnetic interference, compasses spinning wildly. It all pointed to the same conclusion I was trying to avoid. Something beneath the permafrost was actively affecting the environment around it. That night, I reviewed my survey data again, looking for any detail I might have missed. The pyramid structure was consistent across all my measurements, but there was something else. Subtle variations in the electromagnetic readings that suggested complex internal architecture. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just a solid mass of stone. It had chambers, passages, and what looked like intricate internal mechanisms. And according to my instruments, some of those mechanisms were drawing electrical current. I woke up on day 12 to the sound of helicopter rotors. From my trailer window I could see a Black Hawk settling onto a flat area about 200 yards from my camp. No military markings, but the aircraft had the unmistakable look of government hardware. 3 men in winter camouflage climbed out as the rotors spun down. They walked directly to my trailer with the confident stride of people who expected cooperation. The leader was a tall man with close-cropped hair and reflective sunglasses. His companions looked like soldiers trying to dress like civilians, too alert, too fit, and carrying themselves like they had weapons hidden under their jackets. "Mr. Harrison," the leader said, reading my name from a tablet. "I'm Agent Collins, Department of Homeland Security. We need to discuss your recent survey findings." I stepped outside, keeping my expression neutral. I wasn't aware DHS had jurisdiction over pipeline surveys. "We have jurisdiction over potential national security threats." Collins gestured toward my equipment array. "Your seismic activity has been flagged by our monitoring systems. We need to examine your data and confiscate any materials related to subsurface anomalies. What subsurface anomalies? Collins removed his sunglasses, revealing pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. Mr. Harrison, we know exactly what you found down there. The question is whether you're going to cooperate voluntarily or make this difficult. I had two choices: hand over my data willingly or watch them take it by force. Either way, they were getting what they wanted. The hard drives are in the trailer, I said. One of Collins' men immediately headed inside while the other began disconnecting my external monitoring equipment. They worked with practiced efficiency, clearly familiar with this type of confiscation. How long have you known it was there? I asked. Collins was quiet for a long moment, apparently deciding how much to tell me. The structure first appeared on our deep scanning systems in 1992. We've been monitoring it ever since. Appeared? You mean you discovered it in 1992? No, Mr. Harrison. I mean it appeared in 1992. Prior to that date, our scans showed normal bedrock composition. Then something changed. The man emerging from my trailer handed Collins a bag containing my hard drives and backup storage devices. They had also taken my printed survey maps and handwritten notes. 1992, I said, thinking out loud. That's when China conducted their largest underground nuclear test. Collins' expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe, that I'd made that connection. The Lopner test was 3,800 miles away, he said. There's no possible connection. But his tone suggested otherwise. And I remembered something from my geological studies. Seismic waves from large underground explosions can travel through the Earth's crust and trigger responses in sensitive areas thousands of miles away. What if the Chinese nuclear test had somehow activated whatever was buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost? You're being reassigned, Collins continued, handing me an official-looking document. Your contract has been terminated due to unforeseeable circumstances. A helicopter will arrive tomorrow morning to transport you back to Fairbanks. What about my equipment? It's been contaminated by proximity to hazardous materials. Standard decontamination procedures require disposal. That was obviously a lie. There were no hazardous materials in the area. I'd have detected them during my survey. They were confiscating everything because they didn't want me to have any physical evidence of what I'd found. One more thing, Collins said as his team prepared to leave. You'll be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement before returning to civilian areas. The penalty for violating that agreement is 10 years in federal prison. They climbed back into their helicopter and lifted off, leaving me alone with my suddenly empty trailer and a growing certainty that I'd stumbled into something much bigger than a pipeline survey. But I still had one advantage. They thought they'd taken all my data. They were wrong. I've always been paranoid about data backup. Too many years of watching hard drives crash and taking blame for lost survey information. So I keep a small handheld GPS unit with built-in memory storage that automatically logs all my location coordinates and instrument readings. Collins and his team had missed it because it was clipped to my belt, looked like standard hiking gear, and wasn't connected to my main computer systems. That night I reviewed the stored data on the device's tiny screen. Everything was there. Coordinates, depth readings, electromagnetic measurements, and seismic mapping data. Enough information to prove that something massive and artificial was buried beneath the permafrost. But proof wasn't enough. I needed to understand what it was and why the government was so determined to keep it secret. I made a decision that probably should have gotten me killed. I was going back to the site for one final investigation. The helicopter pickup was scheduled for 8 a.m, which gave me about 6 hours of darkness to work with. I loaded basic equipment into my backpack. The handheld GPS, the digital camera, a small electromagnetic field detector, and a battery-powered radio, and hiked back to the survey area. The night was clear and bitterly cold. My breath formed ice crystals that seemed to hang in the air, and the snow crunched under my boots with sounds like breaking glass. Above me, the aurora borealis painted green curtains across the star-filled sky. I reached the coordinates where my instruments had detected the pyramid's apex. According to my calculations, I was standing directly above the structure's highest point, about 120 feet below my boots. The handheld detector immediately started showing readings. Electromagnetic activity was significantly higher than background levels, and it seemed to be increasing. The device's small screen showed wave patterns that looked almost like a heartbeat, regular pulses of energy rising and falling in consistent cycles. I took photos of the instrument readings and recorded GPS coordinates, building a digital record that I could hopefully smuggle out of Alaska. But as I worked, something strange began happening. The aurora overhead was changing. Instead of the usual flowing curtains of light, it was forming geometric patterns, straight lines and angular shapes that mirrored the underground structure. It was as if the buried pyramid was somehow influencing the electromagnetic phenomena in the upper atmosphere. That's when I felt the vibration. It started as a barely perceptible tremor in the ground, like the feeling of a distant freight train. But it quickly intensified until I could feel it in my bones, a deep, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to synchronize with the electromagnetic readings on my detector. The device's screen was flashing warnings. Energy levels were spiking far beyond anything I'd measured during my official survey. Whatever was buried down there was waking up. I started backing away from the site, but before I could get more than 50 yards, everything electronic I carried died simultaneously. The GPS unit, the detector, my digital camera, even my LED flashlight, all dead, as if something had delivered a massive electromagnetic pulse. Above me, the aurora was blazing brighter than I had ever seen, forming complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed to be humming with energy, and I could feel static electricity building up on my clothing and exposed skin. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The aurora faded back to normal patterns. The ground vibration ceased. The electrical sensation disappeared. I was left standing in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness in complete darkness, holding a handful of dead electronics. I stumbled back toward camp using starlight for navigation, reaching my trailer just before dawn. When I tried to start my truck, the engine turned over immediately. Apparently whatever had killed my handheld electronics hadn't affected the vehicle's more robust electrical system. But I knew what I had experienced wasn't natural. The buried pyramid wasn't just an ancient artifact or geological formation. It was some kind of active installation that could influence electromagnetic fields across a wide area. The question was, what was its purpose? The helicopter arrived exactly at 8 a.m, piloted by a civilian contractor who seemed unaware that he was participating in a government cover-up. During the flight back to Fairbanks, I signed the non-disclosure agreement Collins had mentioned, legally binding myself to remain silent about my discoveries. But signing the paper didn't erase my memory, and it didn't eliminate the data I'd managed to keep hidden. I flew back to Seattle that afternoon and spent the next 2 weeks trying to return to normal life. I updated my resume, contacted potential clients, and attempted to focus on finding my next engineering contract. But I couldn't stop thinking about what lay buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost. Late one night, unable to sleep, I sat down with my laptop and started researching everything I could find about electromagnetic anomalies, underground structures, and the 1992 Chinese nuclear test that Agent Collins had mentioned. What I discovered changed everything. The Chinese test, conducted at the Lop Nure facility on May 21, 1992, was indeed one of the largest underground nuclear explosions ever detonated. The blast was so powerful that seismic monitoring stations around the world recorded the shockwaves as they travelled through the Earth's crust. But that wasn't the interesting part. I found archived scientific papers describing unusual electromagnetic phenomena that occurred globally in the days following the test. Radio disruptions, satellite communication failures, and compass anomalies were reported from locations thousands of miles away from the blast site. Most significantly, several research stations in Alaska reported sudden spikes in local electromagnetic activity, beginning approximately 6 hours after the Chinese detonation. Exactly the amount of time it would take seismic waves to travel through the Earth's crust from Lop Nure to Alaska. I cross-referenced these reports with geological surveys of the Alaskan region and found something that made my blood run cold. Every single electromagnetic anomaly had been reported from locations within a 50-mile radius of my survey site. Whatever was buried there had indeed been activated by the Chinese nuclear test, just as Collins had implied, but the implications went far beyond a simple cause and effect relationship. I started plotting the locations of other reported anomalies on a world map, looking for patterns. What I found was a global network of similar sites, places where electromagnetic activity had spiked following major seismic events, underground installations that seemed to respond to specific triggers. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that the Alaskan Pyramid wasn't unique. It was part of a worldwide system of buried structures, all apparently designed to respond to geological disturbances, but designed by whom, and for what purpose? I thought back to the night I'd witnessed the energy pulse, remembering how the aurora borealis had formed geometric patterns directly above the burial site. Aurora phenomena are caused by charged particles from the sun interacting with Earth's magnetic field. If the underground structure could influence those interactions, it was essentially broadcasting energy into space. What if the buried pyramids weren't ancient monuments at all? What if they were communication devices, a global network designed to transmit signals to somewhere far beyond Earth? The possibility was terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. If I was right, then humanity shared the planet with technology that predated our entire civilization by potentially millions of years. Technology that was still active, still responding to triggers, still sending messages to unknown recipients. I spent weeks researching similar sites around the world, building a database of locations where unusual electromagnetic phenomena had been reported following major seismic events. The pattern that emerged was undeniable, a global network of transmission stations, all apparently activated by disturbances in the Earth's crust. But before I could take my research any further, I received a letter that ended my investigation permanently. The letter arrived exactly 1 month after my return from Alaska. It was delivered by certified mail to my apartment address, though I hadn't given that information to anyone connected with the pipeline project. The return address showed only Department of Interior Special Projects Division, with a Washington, D.C. postal box number. Inside was a single page of official letterhead containing a brief message. Mr. Harrison, this communication serves as final notice regarding your terminated contract with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Project Classification, Black Ice. Subsequent to your departure from the survey area, additional geological analysis has determined that the subsurface structure you detected is not archaeological in nature. The structure is an active installation of unknown origin that poses potential risks to national security. Any attempt to publicise information related to this discovery will result in immediate prosecution under the Espionage Act of 1917. Your signed non-disclosure agreement remains in full effect indefinitely. The installation you discovered is not a relic. It is a machine. Do not pursue further inquiry. Sincerely, Director, Special Projects Division. I read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. They weren't denying what I'd found. They were confirming it. The underground structure was artificial. It was active. And the government had known about it for over 30 years without understanding what it was or who had built it. But the most chilling aspect was the letter's final warning. It is a machine, not a monument, not an archaeological site, not a natural formation, a machine. I thought about the energy pulse I'd witnessed, the geometric patterns in the aurora, the electromagnetic signals that seemed to respond to seismic events around the world. If the buried pyramid was indeed a machine, then its purpose was clear. It was designed to detect and respond to geological disturbances by transmitting signals into space. The question remained, signals to whom? I locked the letter in a safety deposit box along with copies of all my survey data and research findings. If something happened to me, at least there would be evidence that the discovery had been made. But I never published my findings. I never contacted journalists or researchers or anyone else who might be interested in the truth about what lay beneath the Alaskan permafrost, because I realised that some knowledge carries a price too high to pay. If there really was a global network of alien communication devices buried beneath our feet, broadcasting our planet's geological status to unknown recipients in space, then humanity was living on borrowed time. We were tenants on a world that belonged to someone else, someone who had installed monitoring equipment long before our species existed. The machines weren't dormant relics of an ancient civilization. They were active components of a surveillance system that that were still operational after millions of years, and every earthquake, every volcanic eruption, every nuclear test was sending updates to whoever had built them. I returned to my normal life as a civil engineer, taking contracts that kept me far from Alaska and far from any situation that might uncover similar installations. I told myself that ignorance was safer than knowledge, that some secrets were better left buried. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that machine humming beneath the permafrost. I wonder if it's still transmitting. I wonder who's listening. And I wonder what they plan to do when they decide we've learned too much about the world we think we own. For 6 months, I managed to convince myself that forgetting was possible. I took contracts in familiar territories, building inspections in suburban developments, soil analysis for shopping mall construction, routine work that involved nothing more mysterious than concrete and rebar. Then the dream started. At first, they were just fragments, flashes of geometric light, the sound of deep humming that seemed to vibrate through my bones, the sensation of standing on solid ground while everything around me pulsed with invisible energy. I'd wake up with my heart racing and a metallic taste in my mouth as if I'd been breathing electrified air. But the dreams became more vivid as weeks passed. I began seeing the pyramid not from above, as I had during my survey, but from within. Vast chambers carved from black stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Corridors that stretched beyond the reach of any illumination, filled with the constant sound of machinery that had been running for millennia. In these dreams, I wasn't alone. Shadowy figures moved through the passages, tall, elongated forms that seemed more like geometric projections than living beings. They moved with purpose, tending to controls and displays that covered the walls in intricate patterns of light and symbol. The most disturbing part was that they seemed aware of me. In the dreams, they would pause their activities and turn toward me with attention that felt like cold judgment. Without faces I could recognize, without voices I could understand, they somehow communicated a single clear message. I had seen something I wasn't meant to see. I consulted a sleep specialist, thinking the dreams were delayed stress responses from my time in Alaska. She prescribed medication that helped me fall asleep but didn't stop the visions. If anything, the drugs made them more intense, more real, more impossible to dismiss as products of an overwrought imagination. It was during one of these medicated dreams that I saw something new, a global map covered in points of light, each one marking a location where similar pyramids lay buried. The network stretched across every continent, even beneath the ocean floors, hundreds of installation sites, all connected by lines of energy that pulsed in synchronized patterns. I woke from that dream with absolute certainty that I was seeing something real. The buried machines weren't isolated installations. They were nodes in a planetary communication grid that spanned the entire world. 3 days later, I made a decision that changed everything. I started investigating again. Using the global locations from my dreams as starting points, I began researching electromagnetic anomalies and unexplained phenomena at similar sites around the world. What I found was a pattern so consistent it couldn't be coincidental. Every location where I'd dreamed of seeing a pyramid corresponded to a place where unusual events had been reported. The Nazca lines in Peru, built over an area where aircraft instruments malfunctioned regularly. The underwater structures near Bimini in the Bahamas, where submarines had reported mechanical failures and compass deviations. The Giza Plateau in Egypt, where modern surveys had detected massive voids beneath the known pyramids. Each site shared common characteristics: electromagnetic interference, geometric precision in ancient or unexplained structures, and a history of covering up or dismissing scientific findings that couldn't be easily explained. But the most significant pattern was temporal. Every site had experienced increased activity following major seismic events, exactly like the Alaskan installation after the 1992 Chinese nuclear test. I compiled a database of seismic events and electromagnetic anomalies dating back 50 years. The correlation was undeniable. Large earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and underground nuclear tests consistently triggered responses from specific locations around the globe. The buried machines weren't just monitoring geological activity, they were responding to it, broadcasting information about Earth's internal dynamics to receivers beyond our planet. I was building a case for the existence of a global alien surveillance network when I made a discovery that terrified me more than anything I'd found so far. The activity was increasing. According to my research, electromagnetic anomalies at these sites had been relatively stable for decades, showing only minor fluctuations in response to major geological events. But starting in 2020, the baseline activity levels had begun rising at all locations simultaneously. Something was changing. The network was becoming more active, more responsive, more awake. I plotted the activity increases on a timeline and noticed they correlated with something unexpected. The global increase in seismic activity over the past few years. More earthquakes, more volcanic eruptions, more geological instability than had been recorded in previous decades. What if the relationship wasn't cause and effect? What if the buried machines weren't just monitoring geological activity? What if they were causing it? The possibility was so disturbing I initially dismissed it as paranoid speculation. But the more I studied the data, the more compelling the evidence became. The timing was too precise, the correlations too consistent. If I was right, then humanity was living on a planet where alien technology was actively destabilizing the geological systems that supported all life on Earth. But why? What possible purpose could be served by triggering earthquakes and volcanic eruptions? The answer came to me during another dream, but this time I was prepared. I had set up a digital recorder beside my bed, hoping to capture any words or sounds I might make while experiencing the visions. What I heard when I played back the recording the next morning was my own voice, but speaking words I didn't remember saying. Stress testing, planetary stability assessment, structural analysis phase approaching completion. I'd somehow been speaking in the technical language of engineering, describing the geological chaos as if it were a planned evaluation of the planet's physical integrity. The machines weren't trying to destroy Earth, they were testing it. Over the following weeks, I dove deeper into geological data, looking for patterns that might support my terrifying hypothesis. What I found convinced me that the buried network was conducting a systematic analysis of Earth's structural stability. Seismic events weren't random, they were following a pattern. Stress points in tectonic plates were being tested in sequence, as if something was methodically evaluating how much pressure the planet's crust could withstand before catastrophic failure. The 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, the increasing volcanic activity in Indonesia, Italy and Iceland, the unprecedented earthquake swarms in places like Oklahoma and Arkansas. All of these events clustered around locations where I'd identified buried installations. I created detailed models showing how the network might be triggering these events through focused electromagnetic pulses directed at specific geological fault lines. The technology required would be far beyond human capabilities, but for a civilization that could build planet-spanning monitoring networks, it would be routine engineering. But the most chilling aspect of my research was the timeline. If the current rate of geological testing continued, the network would have evaluated every major tectonic system on Earth within the next 5 to 10 years. What would happen when the testing phase was complete? I spent sleepless nights imagining scenarios, planetary mining operations that required clearing the surface of inconvenient biological life, terraforming projects that would remake Earth's atmosphere and geology, or simple property reclamation by the network's builders returning to a world they had left unattended for millennia. None of the possibilities included a future for human civilization. It was during this period of growing despair that I received an unexpected contact that changed everything once again. The email appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning with a subject line that made my blood freeze. Alaskan Survey Data, Classification, Black Ice. The sender's address was scrambled text that looked like a random string of characters, clearly routed through multiple encryption services to hide its origin. But the message content was brief and specific. Mr. Harrison, we know what you've discovered about the global network. Your research parallels investigations conducted by others who have encountered similar installations. A meeting has been arranged. Be at the Starbucks on Pine Street in downtown Seattle tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone. Bring your data. You're not the only one who has seen the machines. The message included no signature, but attached to it was a single photograph that made my hands shake. An image of my own survey equipment at the Alaskan site, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been watching my investigation from a significant distance. Someone had been monitoring me during my time in Alaska, someone who wasn't part of Agent Collins' government team. I spent the entire night debating whether to attend the meeting. It could be a trap, government agents trying to identify how much I knew and what evidence I still possessed. Or it could be exactly what it claimed: contact with others who had discovered the truth about the buried network. In the end, curiosity won over caution. I needed to know if I was really alone in this knowledge, or if there were others working to understand the threat humanity was facing. The Starbucks was crowded with the usual mix of students, business people and remote workers when I arrived at exactly 3 p.m. I ordered coffee and found a table near the back, trying to identify anyone who might be waiting for me. At 3:15, a woman in her 50s approached my table. She had greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wore field clothing that suggested outdoor work, and carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to physical challenges. "Mr. Harrison," she extended her hand. "I'm Catherine Webb. I think we need to talk." She sat down across from me and immediately began speaking in low, urgent tones. "I'm a marine archaeologist. 3 years ago, I was leading a deep-sea survey off the coast of Bermuda, when my team discovered an underwater structure that shouldn't exist. Geometric, massive, and actively generating electromagnetic fields that interfered with our equipment. She opened a tablet and showed me sonar images that looked remarkably similar to my ground-penetrating radar data from Alaska. A pyramid-shaped structure, perfectly symmetrical, sitting on the ocean floor at a depth of nearly a mile. When we tried to publish our findings, the research was classified and our funding was terminated. Sound familiar? I nodded, unable to speak. Catherine continued, "But I kept investigating privately. I found evidence of at least 12 similar installations in deep ocean locations around the world. All of them show the same characteristics: geometric precision, electromagnetic activity, and apparent activation following seismic events." She showed me more images: underwater structures near Japan, the Mediterranean, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Each one was clearly artificial, clearly ancient, and clearly active. "There are others," she said. "A geologist in Australia who found similar structures in the outback. An archaeologist in Egypt who discovered chambers beneath the Sphinx that contain technology that shouldn't exist. A seismologist in Chile who documented electromagnetic pulses preceding earthquake activity. How many others? We've identified 17 researchers worldwide who have encountered installations or phenomena that appear to be part of the same network. Most have been silenced through official pressure, funding cuts, or career destruction. A few have simply disappeared." Catherine leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But some of us have continued working in secret. We've been sharing data, building a comprehensive picture of what we're dealing with. And what are we dealing with? A global surveillance and control system that's been operating for thousands of years, possibly millions. The installations aren't just monitoring Earth, they're managing it, controlling geological processes, atmospheric composition, even biological evolution through environmental manipulation. The implications hit me like a physical blow. We're not alone on this planet. We never have been. The question is whether humanity developed naturally, or whether we're the result of controlled biological development guided by whoever built the network." Catherine showed me more data. Archaeological evidence of genetic bottlenecks in human evolution that corresponded to periods of unusual geological activity, atmospheric changes that seemed to follow patterns rather than random climate variation, even extinction events that appeared to have been artificially triggered. "The network has been shaping Earth's development for millions of years," she said. "Every mass extinction, every ice age, every major evolutionary leap has been guided by the installations. But why? What's the purpose?" Catherine's expression was grim. "We think Earth is being prepared for something. The stress testing you've documented, the increasing seismic activity, the atmospheric changes, it all points to final preparations for some kind of major transition. Transition to what? We don't know, but based on the escalating activity levels, we estimate it will begin within the next few years. She handed me a secure phone with an encrypted communication app. If you want to help us understand what we're facing, this will put you in contact with the others. We're working to decode transmissions from the installations to map the complete network, and to find some way to predict what's coming. What if we can't stop it? Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then at least humanity will know the truth before the end. Over the following months, I became part of an underground network of researchers from around the world. Using encrypted communications and careful operational security, we shared data, theories, and discoveries about the installations that had consumed our professional lives. What emerged from our collective research was a picture of Earth that challenged everything humanity believed about our planet and our place in the universe. The installation network was vast. Over 300 confirmed sites across all continents and ocean floors. Each site contained structures of identical design but varying scale, all built from materials that didn't match any known geological formations. The construction showed evidence of technology far beyond human capabilities, with precision that exceeded our best modern engineering. But the most significant discovery came from Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a linguist and cryptographer in Japan who'd been analysing electromagnetic transmissions intercepted from the installations. The transmissions weren't random energy pulses, they were coded communications in a mathematical language that described Earth's physical and biological status in incredible detail. Real-time reports on atmospheric composition, geological stability, ocean chemistry, magnetic field fluctuations and biological diversity levels. More disturbing were the projections embedded in the transmissions, mathematical models showing how Earth systems would respond to various environmental stresses, including massive geological disruptions, atmospheric changes and population adjustments. The network was continuously updating these models based on data from the stress testing we documented. Each earthquake, each volcanic eruption, each environmental change provided new information that refined the projections, and all of the models pointed to the same conclusion: a massive intervention scheduled to begin when current biological systems reached predetermined stress thresholds. We were approaching those thresholds rapidly. Climate change, resource depletion, ecological collapse, and social instability were all being monitored by the network. But rather than random consequences of human activity, they appeared to be planned phases in a managed transition process. Humanity hadn't created the environmental crisis. We were living through the final stages of a controlled experiment that had been running for thousands of years. The realization was overwhelming. Every environmental disaster, every resource shortage, every social conflict was part of a planned sequence designed to bring Earth's biological systems to a specific end state. But what would replace them? The answer came from an unexpected source: my dreams. As I became more deeply involved with the research network, my nighttime visions became more detailed and informative. I was seeing not just the installations, but the purpose they served. The geometric beings I encountered in the dreams weren't aliens. They were artificial intelligences, created by the network's builders to manage Earth's transition through automated systems. The real builders were gone, had been gone for millions of years, but they had left behind a planetary management system designed to prepare Earth for their eventual return. The stress testing, the environmental manipulation, the biological management, it was all preparation for recolonization by a species that had left Earth eons ago and was now ready to reclaim it. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that machine humming beneath the permafrost. I wonder if it's still transmitting. I wonder who's listening. And I wonder what they plan to do when they decide we've learned too much about the world we think we own. Because now I know the truth. We are temporary occupants of a world that has always belonged to someone else. The installations beneath our feet are counting down to a transition that will remake Earth according to specifications we cannot understand for purposes we cannot imagine. The truth is out there, buried beneath the ice in places like Alaska, waiting for the next contractor or surveyor or accidental discoverer to stumble across it. When that happens, and it will happen eventually, I hope they're wiser than I was. I hope they don't go back for one final look in the darkness, because some machines are better left undisturbed, and some signals are better left unsent. But the signals are being sent anyway, carrying reports of a planet ready for reclamation by its original inhabitants. The countdown has begun, and we are running out of time to understand what we're facing, or to find a way to survive what's coming. They moved with efficient, brutal precision that spoke of years of practice and unlimited resources. Men in dark tactical gear emblazoned with HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, flooded her apartment like a coordinated invasion force. They carried electronic jammers that immediately killed her internet connection and cell phone signal, ensuring that no evidence of the raid could be transmitted to the outside world. Mara didn't resist. She couldn't. The revelation of her own name in the exercise documents had shattered something fundamental in her understanding of reality. She sat frozen in her chair as they systematically dismantled her entire investigation, bagging computers, hard drives, printed documents, and the original VHS tape that had started everything. Mara Ellison, the team leader announced, his voice carrying the flat, bureaucratic authority of someone who had recited these words many times before. You are being detained under the Espionage Act and the provisions of the Patriot Act for the unauthorized access of classified material and conspiracy to aid terrorist entities in their ongoing operations against the United States. The charges were absurd, but Mara understood that absurdity was the point. In the post-9/11 legal framework, the government's definition of terrorism had expanded to include almost any activity that challenged official narratives. Her research, her questions, her very curiosity had been redefined as acts of treason. As they led her out in handcuffs, past the terrified faces of neighbours who would remember her as the woman who had turned out to be a spy, Mara caught a glimpse of someone watching from across the street. It was Kellerman, the man from the cafe, observing her arrest with the detached professionalism of someone monitoring a completed operation. Their eyes met for a brief moment and he nodded slightly, not in greeting or sympathy, but in acknowledgement, a confirmation that everything had proceeded according to plan. The government's case against her was presented in a sealed FISA court, where neither the evidence nor the proceedings were accessible to public scrutiny. They had documentation of her accessing classified servers, recordings of her encrypted communications with foreign assets like at Radar Ghost, and her own research notes that they characterized as intelligence gathering for hostile entities. They presented her investigation not as the work of a concerned citizen or independent researcher, but as a sophisticated espionage operation designed to undermine public confidence in government institutions and aid terrorist recruitment. Every question she had asked was reframed as an attack on national security. Every fact she had uncovered was presented as intelligence that could be used against American interests. The judge, operating under national security guidelines that prioritise state secrets over due process, sentenced her to indefinite detention in ADX Florence, the federal supermax facility designed to make dangerous criminals disappear from the world. She was classified as a level 6 terrorist, a designation that eliminated most constitutional protections and ensured that she would spend the rest of her life in solitary confinement. But something unexpected happened in the weeks following her arrest. Fragments of her research began appearing online, leaked to conspiracy theory websites and alternative media platforms in carefully edited chunks. Anonymous accounts uploaded her audio analysis comparing the ATC recordings, her financial charts tracking the put options, and scanned pages from Dr. Thorne's suppressed paper. The leaks were incomplete and disconnected, presenting tantalizing glimpses of a larger truth without providing the comprehensive narrative that Mara had spent months constructing. Each fragment raised more questions than it answered, creating a puzzle that thousands of amateur researchers began trying to solve. The story spread through the conspiracy theory ecosystem with viral intensity. Mara Ellison became a martyred truth-teller, a patriotic whistleblower who had been silenced by a tyrannical government for asking inconvenient questions. Her name appeared on protest signs and bumper stickers. Her fragmented research became the foundational text of a new generation of 9/11 truth-seekers who built elaborate theories around the gaps in her evidence. Online forums dedicated to her case attracted hundreds of thousands of members who spent countless hours analysing every leaked document, enhancing every audio file, and connecting dots that may or may not have been related. The movement consumed enormous amounts of time and energy from people who might otherwise have been investigating more immediate and actionable forms of government corruption. In her solitary cell, staring at concrete walls that never varied, Mara had years to think about what had really happened to her. She had access to limited reading materials, carefully selected books and magazines that were screened for security risks, but no internet, no phone calls, and no contact with the outside world except for monthly visits from a government-appointed psychiatrist who documented her mental state for official records. During those long, empty hours, she began to understand the true sophistication of the operation she had been part of. The evidence she had uncovered was real. The financial anomalies, the radar substitutions, the media manipulation had all been genuine. But her discovery of them hadn't been accidental. She had been led to each revelation by a carefully constructed trail that had made her feel like an independent investigator while actually being a participant in a psychological experiment. The goal wasn't to suppress inconvenient truths about September 11th. It was to manage them, to ensure that people who asked dangerous questions were given satisfying, but ultimately harmless answers that would occupy their attention without threatening the real power structures that had profited from the attacks. Her research had been allowed to develop just far enough to create compelling conspiracy theories, but not far enough to identify the specific individuals and institutions that were actually responsible. She had mapped the edges of the conspiracy while being carefully steered away from its centre. The 9/11 truth movement that had grown around her, leaked research was exactly what the system needed. A large, vocal, but ultimately marginalised group that absorbed dissent and channeled it into harmless activities like conference presentations, documentary films, and internet discussions. The conspiracy theorists served as controlled opposition, providing an outlet for skepticism while ensuring that genuine investigation was drowned in a sea of speculation and theory. But perhaps most insidiously, her case had established a precedent for the treatment of future researchers. Anyone who began asking serious questions about government actions would be confronted with the example of Mara Ellison, the translator who had thought she was uncovering truth, but had actually been playing a role in an elaborate deception, and who had ended up spending her life in prison for crimes she didn't understand she was committing. The message was clear. The cost of curiosity was too high, the risk of investigation was too great, and the line between research and treason was too thin for ordinary citizens to navigate safely. Years passed in the unchanging routine of maximum security imprisonment. Mara aged in her cell, her dark hair going grey, her body adapting to the constraints of a space designed to contain rather than rehabilitate. She developed the 1,000-yard stare common to long-term solitary confinement, a psychological adjustment to environmental deprivation that allowed consciousness to survive even when hope had been systematically eliminated. But her mind remained sharp and she continued to think about the implications of her experience. If her investigation had been managed from the beginning, if her discoveries had been strategically placed for her to find, then how many other conspiracy theories were actually psychological operations designed to misdirect public attention? How many whistleblowers had been selected and groomed for their role? How many leaked documents were authentic information released in carefully controlled ways to create the illusion of transparency while actually deepening the confusion? How many truth seekers were unwittingly serving the interests of the very systems they believed they were opposing? The questions haunted her, but they also provided a strange form of comfort. Even in prison, even stripped of freedom and identity, she was still thinking, still analysing, still trying to understand the shape of the cage that had been built around human consciousness. In her 10th year of imprisonment, Mara received an unexpected visitor. The guard who escorted her to the visitation room was apologetic. Visits were rare, and this one hadn't been scheduled through normal channels. The visitor was a young woman, perhaps 25, with the intense focus and slightly manic energy that Mara recognised in herself from decades earlier. "Ms. Ellison," the woman said, speaking quickly as if afraid their time would be cut short. "My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've been researching your case for the past 3 years, and I think I've found something important. Something about Building 7 that nobody has ever." Mara held up her hand, stopping the young woman mid-sentence. Through the reinforced glass that separated them, she looked into Rebecca's eager, determined face and saw herself at the beginning of a journey that could only end in this same room on the other side of the same glass. "Ms. Torres," Mara said quietly, her voice rough from years of disuse, "let me ask you something. How did you first learn about my case? What was the first piece of evidence that made you think there was a story worth investigating?" Rebecca's enthusiasm was undimmed. It was a video file that was posted anonymously to a secure drop site, footage of Building 7 that I'd never seen before, with audio that hadn't been available in any of the official archives. The timing discrepancies were obvious once you knew what to look for. Mara closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. Another tape, another anomaly, another researcher being led down a carefully prepared path that would feel like discovery, while actually being manipulation. "Ms. Torres," she said, opening her eyes and looking directly at the young filmmaker, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to walk out of here, delete whatever research you've done and never think about any of this again." But even as she spoke, Mara knew it was hopeless. Rebecca Torres had the same look in her eyes that Mara had once seen in her own mirror, the absolute certainty that she was on the verge of uncovering a truth that would change everything. The same conviction that had led Mara to spend 20 years in a cage built from her own curiosity. The cycle would continue. New researchers would be recruited, new evidence would be strategically placed, new truth seekers would be transformed into unwitting participants in their own imprisonment. The conspiracy wasn't just about what had happened on September 11th. It was about what happened to anyone who tried to look too closely at power, who asked too many questions, who believed that truth was something that could be found rather than something that was manufactured. As the guard led her back to her cell, Mara realised that she had finally understood the true scope of the operation she had been part of. It wasn't a conspiracy to hide a single crime. It was a system for managing reality itself, for ensuring that the truth would always be whatever those in power needed it to be. The smoke behind the towers wasn't just the debris of a single day's deception. It was the fog of war in a conflict that most people didn't even know was being fought. A war against the very possibility of independent thought, waged with weapons of information and cages built from curiosity itself. And in that war, every truth seeker was both a casualty and a weapon, both a victim and an unwitting soldier in an army that was fighting against its own cause. The tape that shouldn't exist had led her exactly where it was supposed to lead her, into a truth that was indistinguishable from a lie, a cage that was built from the very evidence that had seemed to promise freedom. In the end, Mara Ellison had found exactly what she was looking for, and that, perhaps, was the most terrifying revelation of all. The smoke behind the towers, an extended investigation. What if the single most defining event of the 21st century wasn't what we were told? We've all seen the footage, heard the official story, and lived with the consequences. But what happens when a single piece of evidence lost in the system for over 2 decades falls into the hands of the one person with the skills and obsession to see the cracks in the narrative. This is not a story about easy answers, it's a story about the questions that can unravel a reality. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Sleep Theories and hit the notification bell. We dive deep into the world's greatest mysteries, and what you're about to read will have you questioning everything. In the comments below, let us know. After learning about the inconsistencies, what's the one piece of the 9/11 puzzle that never sat right with you? Now settle in. This is the smoke behind the towers. The dust in Mara Ellison's apartment was a library of dead projects. It settled on the spines of German legal dictionaries, coated the cooling fins of her overworked computer, and formed a fine grey film on the stacked plastic boxes of government transcripts that were her livelihood. The apartment itself was a testament to organised chaos. Cables snaking between translation equipment, multiple keyboards in different alphabets, and towers of reference materials that threatened to topple with each vibration from the subway below. Mara was a freelance translator, a ghost in the machine of bureaucracy, hired for her fluency in 5 languages and her singular, obsessive attention to detail. She didn't just translate words, she translated context, subtext, and the terrifying silence between official lines. Her clients ranged from immigration lawyers needing farcy depositions, translated to federal agencies requiring real-time interpretation of intercepted communications. It was solitary work that suited her temperament. She'd always been more comfortable with the precision of language than the chaos of human interaction. The package from the Department of Defense's Archival Division was standard. A reinforced cardboard box, a chain of custody form clipped to the top, and inside 12 VHS tapes labelled with alphanumeric codes denoting a declassified batch of field communications from the early 2000s. The accompanying documentation was sparse. A single-page memo requesting translation of any foreign language chatter captured in the background. The pay was modest but steady, and Mara had developed a reputation for catching linguistic details that others missed. Her workspace was a shrine to analogue precision. The professional-grade VCR, a Sony model worth more than most people's cars, sat connected to a digital audio interface that allowed her to isolate frequency ranges and enhance muffled conversations. Multiple monitors displayed waveform analysis software alongside translation databases. She worked methodically, her headphones sealing her in a world of static, fragmented Farsi, Arabic phrases, and the ambient hum of old magnetic tape. The first 11 tapes were unremarkable. Routine military communications, helicopter pilots discussing weather conditions, occasional snippets of foreign languages that were either too corrupted to translate or turned out to be harmless civilian chatter picked up by sensitive equipment. She documented everything with academic precision, noting timestamps, speaker identifications, and confidence levels for her translations. Tape 7 was different from the moment she picked it up. Its label, DOD-AFC-0, 91101-BROLL-4, was slightly smudged, the ink appearing fresher than the others despite the identical date stamps. The B-roll designation caught her attention, typically used for supplementary footage, background material that never made it to air. September 11th, 2001 was faded but legible in the corner, written in what looked like different handwriting than the official labels. She slotted it into the VCR with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a fragile artifact, and pressed play. The screen fizzed to life with a chaotic, familiar horror of that morning. But this wasn't the sanitized, repeatedly broadcast footage that had been burned into collective memory. This was raw, unprocessed, shot from what appeared to be a news helicopter hovering at an angle she'd never seen before. The North Tower bled a furious black plume into a perfect blue sky, but the colours were wrong. They were too vivid, too saturated, as if the horror had been amplified by the unfiltered lens. Her trained eye, honed by years of spotting inconsistencies in testimony and documentation, caught it immediately. In the lower third of the frame, a timecode burned into the tape read 08:42:17 Eastern Standard Time. She knew the official timeline by heart. American Airlines. Flight 11 had struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., a 4-minute discrepancy. A chill, small and precise, traced a path down her spine. Technical errors were common in archival footage, she rationalised. Equipment malfunctions, camera operators forgetting to sync their timestamps. She'd seen it hundreds of times in legal depositions where security cameras showed impossible timelines. But as she continued watching, the discrepancy held. The timecode advanced in perfect synchronization with real time, never jumping or resetting. This wasn't a technical glitch. It was consistent, deliberate, accurate. And if it was accurate, then everything she knew about that morning was built on a foundation of sand. Then she heard the voices. They were not the panicked cries of civilians or the frantic dispatches of news anchors that had filled the airwaves. These voices were cool, professional, crackling with the distinct compression of military-grade communication systems. They were barely audible under the rotor wash and wind noise, but her equipment could isolate and enhance them. "Command, this is Skywatch. Confirmed scenario is live. Repeat, is this Vigilant Guardian live or real world?" The voice was young, male, with the clipped precision of military training but an undertone of confusion that made Mara's pulse quicken. A pause, filled with the sound of roaring fire and distant sirens. When the response came, it was from a different voice, older, calmer, carrying the authority of rank. "Maintain exercise protocol. All units. This is a live fly exercise. Treat all tracks as simulated until otherwise notified." The first voice came back, strain creeping in. "Skywatch copies. Maintaining protocol. Jesus, that's a lot of smoke for a simulation." Another voice joined the channel, different again, with a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. "Command, Falcon 2 requesting permission to vector intercept on the southern track. We show multiple bogies, but exercise parameters did not account for this density. Negative Falcon 2, maintain exercise posture. All tracks are part of the scenario until command confirms otherwise." Mara's breath caught in her throat. Vigilant Guardian. The name meant nothing to her, but the context was unmistakable. They were talking about an exercise, a drill, at the exact moment when the real attack was unfolding. The confusion in their voices was genuine. They couldn't tell what was real and what was simulation. She rewound the tape, listening again with professional focus. The voices were too clear to be atmospheric noise, too organised to be random civilian communications. This was operational military chatter, recorded at the highest levels of the response hierarchy. And according to the time code, it was happening before the official narrative said the first plane had even hit. The camera panned, and she saw the South Tower in the background, pristine and untouched. According to every official record, every news report, every commission finding, the South Tower would remain undamaged for another 17 minutes. But these military voices were already talking about multiple targets, exercise protocols, and maintaining simulation status. The official story was a solid wall, a monument of accepted fact constructed from thousands of testimonies, investigations and reports. But this tape was a hairline fracture in the granite. It was a glimpse of the scaffolding behind the monument, the framework that held up the official truth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. The rational part of her mind insisted this was a mislabeled tape, a bureaucratic error. Her contract was explicit about mishandled materials. They were to be reported immediately, returned to the appropriate authorities for proper classification review. But curiosity, that quiet, relentless engine that had driven her through graduate school and into a career built on uncovering meaning in chaos, overrode the fear. She didn't eject the tape. Instead, she connected it to her digital capture system and began making a perfect copy, frame by frame, preserving every pixel and every audio sample. The chill in her spine had become a frozen river, carrying with it the terrible realization that she was holding something that could unravel everything. This tape shouldn't exist, and she knew, with the terrifying certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime connecting dots that others refused to see, that she could never unsee what was on it. As the tape played on, she began taking meticulous notes, documenting call signs, voice patterns, and radio procedures. The military communications continued throughout the footage, painting a picture of an operation that was simultaneously a drill and a real-world crisis, a Schrödinger's catastrophe where reality and simulation existed in quantum superposition, until someone with the authority to collapse the wave function decided what was real. That someone, she was beginning to suspect, was not who the world thought it was. Sleep didn't come. The images played on the backs of her eyelids in an endless loop. The impossibly blue sky, the black smoke billowing against it, the time code burning like a digital scar across her vision. The voices echoed in her memory, their professional calm masking confusion that ran deeper than anyone had ever admitted publicly. By 5 a.m, she was at her desk, the glow of her monitors the only light in the pre-dawn gloom of her apartment. The city outside was beginning its daily resurrection, but Mara existed in a different timeline now, one where the morning of September 11th, 2001 was not history, but an active investigation. Her first stop was the public archive of the 9/11 Commission, a digital tomb containing thousands of pages of testimony, exhibits, and evidence. She had accessed these files before for various translation projects, but now she approached them with the focus of a detective rather than a linguist. The official transcripts were sanitized, edited for clarity and context, with extensive redactions that created black holes in the narrative where sensitive information had been surgically removed. But buried deep in a subsidiary server, linked through footnotes and cross-references that most casual researchers would never follow, she found the motherlode. Raw audio files from air traffic control centers. These were the unedited feeds from Boston Center, New York Terminal Radar Approach Control, and Cleveland Center, the front lines of confusion that morning. She put on her professional headphones, the world fading away as she prepared to immerse herself in the chaos. The audio quality was poor, compressed through multiple digital transfers over 2 decades, but her equipment could clean it up. She opened her spectrum analysis software and began the painstaking process of isolating individual voices from the cacophony. The first recordings were exactly what she expected. Controllers struggling to understand what was happening to American Airlines Flight 11. The standard protocols were breaking down in real time as they tried to re-establish contact with a plane that was no longer responding to their calls. American 11, Boston Center, are you there? The controller's voice was professional but edged with the first hints of concern. Static filled the channel. American 11, Boston Center, please respond. More urgent now, the procedural calm beginning to crack. Then a new voice entered the channel, higher pitched, laced with confusion. Boston Center, this is New York approach. We're showing a primary target, fast mover, not squawking transponder. Is this part of the Nordo drill? Nordo, no radio communications. Mara's blood turned to ice water. The Boston controller's response was immediate and sharp. What drill? I don't have anything about a drill on the roster today. What's your location on that primary? Another voice cut in. Different frequency, probably a pilot monitoring emergency channels. Center, this is Delta 243 Heavy. We're hearing some strange chatter on guard frequency. Are we exercising today? Our dispatcher didn't mention anything. Delta 243, stand by. We're trying to sort out some communication issues with one of our aircraft. But the pilot pressed. Center, serious question. We're showing traffic on our TCAS that doesn't correlate with what you're calling out. Our system is painting targets where you're not showing anything. Is this part of some kind of exercise? The timestamp on this exchange was 8:43 a.m, 3 minutes before the official time of impact. The confusion wasn't happening after the attack. It was the environment in which the attack was unfolding. The system was already compromised, already uncertain about what was real and what was simulation. Mara spent the next 16 hours obsessively comparing this raw audio to the sanitized news footage from that morning, using professional editing software to align timelines with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. She created a split-screen comparison, audio waveforms on one side, video timestamps on the other, and she found them, the edits. In the raw ATC tape, a controller could be heard screaming, "He's descending fast, passing 9,000 rate of descent. Jesus Christ, what the hell is he?" The audio cut out completely for exactly 0.2 of a second. A perfect digital slice that could only have been made in post-production. When it resumed, a different controller was speaking in measured professional tones. "We have an aircraft emergency, requesting immediate vectors for emergency descent." The panic had been surgically removed, replaced with standard phraseology that suggested control rather than chaos. She found 17 such edits in the first hour of ATC audio alone. Each one removed confusion, uncertainty, or references to exercises and drills. The real-time breakdown of the air traffic control system had been edited into a narrative of professionals responding to an unprecedented but comprehensible crisis. But the video footage revealed even more sophisticated manipulation. She had obtained raw news helicopter footage from multiple sources, some from official archives, others from amateur collectors who had recorded the live broadcasts. Frame-stepping through a raw feed uploaded by a news photographer years later, she discovered something that made her hands shake. The famous shot of the second impact, broadcast live to millions, showed the plane entering the frame and striking the South Tower in one continuous motion. But in the unedited raw footage, there was a discontinuity. 3 frames before the impact, the camera jerked violently downward, as if the operator had been startled or knocked off balance, showing the streets below for exactly 1/8 of a second before cutting back to the tower, just in time to capture the fireball. It was a blink and you miss it edit, but once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The live broadcast had been edited in real time, with a buffer delay that allowed editors to remove the moment of human shock and replace it with a perfect, unobstructed view of the impact. The audience of one in her dusty apartment was now facing a terrifying possibility. The news wasn't just reporting the event, it was curating it in real time, managing the narrative as it unfolded, ensuring that the world saw exactly what someone wanted them to see. The difference between what happened and what was broadcast might be measured in fractions of seconds, but those fractions contained entire universes of meaning. She pulled up the official timeline, cross-referencing it with her growing database of anomalies. The pattern was clear. Every moment of confusion, every instance where the official response system revealed its underlying chaos, had been carefully edited out of the historical record. What remained was a streamlined narrative of surprise, response, and tragedy, clean enough to build policy on, coherent enough to justify the reshaping of an entire civilization. But the real story was in the gaps, in the deleted seconds where the facade slipped and revealed the machinery underneath. The tape she had found wasn't just evidence of poor timekeeping or sloppy journalism. It was proof that someone had been editing history in real time, sculpting reality as it unfolded, ensuring that the official story would be the only story that survived. The question that now consumed her was simple and terrible. If they were editing the news as it happened, what else were they controlling? The digital rabbit hole led her inevitably to the physical world. Knowledge had a weight, she realised, and after 3 days of staring at screens, she needed to feel the heft of actual books, the texture of paper that had existed before the internet had made all information suspect. The New York Public Library's Science, Industry and Business Library was a temple to pre-digital knowledge, its research floors filled with bound periodicals and technical journals that predated the homogenization of online information. She took the subway through the early morning darkness, hyper-aware of every face, every reflection in the train windows, the paranoia now a constant background hum in her consciousness. She requested archived journals from the American Society of Civil Engineers, Structural Engineering International, and the Journal of Constructional Steel Research, focusing on publications from late 2001 through 2003. The librarian, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who seemed to exist in permanent twilight, led her to a research carrel buried deep in the stacks. The official reports were unequivocal and had been cited thousands of times. The intense jet fuel fires had softened the steel structural members, causing thermal expansion that pushed the floor joists off their supports. The floors pancaked down onto each other, in a progressive collapse that accelerated due to the increasing mass and momentum. It was tragic but straightforward physics. Fire weakens steel, gravity does the rest. But in the months immediately following the attacks, before the official narrative had crystallized and academic careers had been threatened, a different conversation was happening in the margins of professional literature. She found letters to the editor, brief technical notes, and transcripts from early conferences where structural engineers voiced quiet, professional skepticism. One article, published in a now-defunct journal called Structural Integrity Review, bore the innocuous title Anomalies in the WTC Collapse Dynamics, a Preliminary Analysis. The author was Dr. Aris Thorne, a professor of structural engineering at Northwestern University with 40 years of experience in high-rise design and failure analysis. Dr. Thorne's analysis was methodical and damning. Using basic principles of physics and publicly available measurements, he demonstrated that the towers had fallen through the path of greatest resistance, the undamaged lower floors and the intact core columns at virtually free-fall speed. For that to happen, he argued, the structural resistance had to have been removed almost entirely and almost simultaneously. The observed collapse is consistent with the near instantaneous failure of critical load-bearing elements across multiple floors, he wrote. This failure mode is not consistent with thermal effects from hydrocarbon fires, which would create non-uniform heating and progressive failure. It is, however, consistent with controlled demolition techniques designed to minimize structural resistance during collapse. He included mathematical models showing that even if the fires had weakened the steel by 50%, far more than the official reports claimed, the remaining structure should have provided significant resistance to collapse. The floors should have fallen irregularly, the core columns should have remained standing, and the overall collapse time should have been significantly longer. It is akin to a car falling through the bottom of a multi-storey parking garage, he wrote, with each floor providing progressively less resistance, despite having suffered no structural damage. The physics simply do not support the official explanation. The article was peer-reviewed and published in March 2002. 3 months later, Dr. Thorne's research funding was terminated. By the end of the year, the journal itself had ceased publication, its parent organisation citing financial difficulties and changing market conditions. But Mara's investigation revealed a more complex story. Cross-referencing the journal's subscription database with the author affiliations in Dr. Thorne's article, she discovered that 7 of the 12 peer reviewers who had approved the paper were subsequently denied tenure, transferred to non-research positions, or had their federal funding mysteriously disappear. The systematic dismantling of the academic infrastructure that had supported the questioning of the official narrative was surgical in its precision. Dr. Thorne himself became her new obsession. His university profile, archived on the Internet Wayback Machine, showed a distinguished career spanning 4 decades, with over 200 published papers and millions of dollars in research grants. But in early 2002, his page was updated to show that he had taken an indefinite sabbatical for personal reasons. She dug deeper, following a trail through archived academic mailing lists, conference proceedings, and professional networking sites. The last traces of Dr. Thorne's professional existence were found in a niche engineering message board devoted to structural failure analysis. The forum had been active from 1997 to 2003, when it was apparently taken offline permanently. But Mara had learned to look in the forgotten corners of the internet, the places where data went to die but never quite disappeared. Using advanced search techniques and cached page reconstructions, she found fragments of the discussion threads. Dr. Thorne's final posts were increasingly frantic in tone. He described pressure from university administrators, threats to his family's safety, and mysterious visitors who claimed to be federal investigators but carried no proper identification. His last post, dated September 15, 2002, exactly 1 year and 4 days after the attacks, was brief and chilling. The data is the data. Mathematical models don't lie. Steel doesn't care about politics, and gravity is not a government agency. They can threaten my funding, my reputation, even my family. But they can't change the laws of physics. I've said all I can. To those still listening, they're watching. I suggest you all be careful what you look for. You might not like what finds you back." He never posted again. A follow-up news search revealed a brief article from the Chicago Tribune, buried on page 7 of the Metro section 6 months later. "University professor missing. Foul play not suspected." The article was perfunctory, almost dismissive. Dr. Thorne had been reported missing by his sister when he failed to appear for Christmas dinner. His car was found at O'Hare Airport, keys in the ignition, a plane ticket to Vancouver in his name unused at the gate. Professor Thorne had been under considerable stress related to academic disputes, an unnamed university spokesperson was quoted as saying. "This appears to be a case of someone needing to start fresh somewhere else." But there was no trail after that. No credit card usage, no bank withdrawals, no rental agreements or employment records under his name, or any obvious aliases. Dr. Aris Thorne, a man who had spent 40 years building a paper trail of academic achievement, had simply evaporated. Mara closed her eyes in the sterile library lighting, the weight of the revelation settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The systematic silencing hadn't been limited to Dr. Thorne. As she continued her research, she found a pattern of structural engineers, metallurgists, and physics professors who had raised questions about the official collapse narrative in those crucial first months after the attacks. All of them had faced professional consequences. All of them had been marginalised, defunded or discredited, and all of them had eventually stopped asking questions about September 11th. The few who continued their research had moved to other countries, found positions in private industry, or simply disappeared from the academic record entirely. What remained was a consensus not of discovery but of survival, a scientific community that had learned, through selective pressure and systematic intimidation, that certain questions would not be tolerated. The official story wasn't just the accepted version of events, it was the only version that was professionally survivable. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave the library, Mara felt exposed under the flickering fluorescent lights. The paranoia was no longer abstract. There was a physical sensation, a cold certainty that she was being observed, catalogued, evaluated for the threat she might represent. The knowledge she was accumulating had a price, she realised, and others had already paid it. The question now was whether she would be added to the list of people who had learned too much for their own good. The feeling of being watched had evolved from paranoia into operational security. Mara began varying her routines, taking different routes home, using cash for purchases, and conducting her most sensitive research from internet cafes and public libraries, rather than her home computer. She had read enough about surveillance to know that once you were on someone's radar, digital footprints became roadmaps to your location and intentions. She also began using layered VPNs, routing her internet traffic through servers in countries with strong privacy laws, and communicating through encrypted channels that existed in the shadow spaces of the internet. Her investigation moved from mainstream archives to the digital underworld where disgruntled employees, amateur researchers, and information brokers traded in data that governments preferred to keep buried. It was in one such forum, a dark website dedicated to air disaster investigations and aviation anomalies, that she encountered the handle at Radar Ghost. His initial posts in the 9/11 section were bitter rants about cover-ups and government lies, the kind of conspiracy theorising that most serious researchers ignored. But buried in his rambling messages were technical details that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of air traffic control systems. After weeks of careful cultivation, building trust through shared technical knowledge and encrypted private messages, that Radar Ghost agreed to share something that had haunted him for over 20 years. "This will cost me everything if it's traced back to me," he wrote, in a message encrypted with military-grade protocols. "I was working approach control at a facility that doesn't exist in any official record. We had primary radar coverage of the entire East Coast corridor. I saw things that morning that were scrubbed from every official database, but I kept copies. Insurance, you understand. Don't disappoint me." The file arrived 3 days later, a massive data dump disguised as a corrupted email attachment. When Mara finally decrypted and decompressed it, she found herself staring at 24 hours of raw primary radar returns from September 11th, 2001, Not the sanitized transponder data that appeared in official reports, but the unfiltered radar reflections from every object in the sky over the eastern United States. The data was overwhelming. Commercial airliners, private jets, military aircraft, weather balloons, and the electronic noise that cluttered the airspace of the world's busiest aviation corridor. It took her days to write filtering algorithms, cleaning the data, and tracking specific radar signatures through the chaos. She focused first on American Airlines Flight 77, the Boeing 757 that had allegedly struck the Pentagon. The official story was straightforward. The flight had departed Dulles International Airport on schedule, proceeded normally for 36 minutes, then turned off its transponder over southern Ohio, made a wide U-turn back toward Washington, and descended into the Pentagon at high speed. But the raw radar data told a more complex story. The transponder signal for Flight 77 did indeed vanish over Ohio at 8:56 a.m., exactly as the official report stated. But the primary radar target, the physical reflection from the aircraft itself, continued westward for another 63 nautical miles before it simply disappeared from the screen. It didn't fade gradually or descend below radar coverage. It vanished instantly, as if the aircraft had been switched off like a light bulb. Simultaneously, a new primary target appeared on the scope near the West Virginia border, moving southeast at 540 knots toward Washington, D.C. This new radar signature had the exact characteristics of a Boeing 757. The same cross-sectional area, the same speed capabilities, the same flight profile. But according to the official timeline, the real Flight 77 was already well to the east and no longer under radar coverage. The timing was surgical in its precision. The original target disappeared at exactly 9:09:32 a.m. The new target appeared at 9:09:34 a.m., 2 seconds later and 60 miles to the south. It was as if the aircraft had been teleported, or as if one plane had been replaced by another in a carefully choreographed handoff. Radar Ghost's encrypted messages provided context. See it now? The swap. We called it aircraft substitution in our training manuals, something the military practices during war games when they need to simulate different aircraft types or flight profiles. They paint a new bird on the screen using electronic countermeasures, make the old one disappear using radar jammers. We saw what they wanted us to see. Mara cross-referenced the radar data with archived flight tracking information from that morning. The pattern became even more disturbing when she examined United Airlines Flight 175, which had struck the South Tower. Like Flight 77, its transponder signal disappeared over New Jersey, but the primary radar returns showed the aircraft continuing north for another 40 miles, before vanishing and being replaced by a different target that descended into Manhattan. The implications were staggering. The radar evidence suggested that the aircraft everyone watched strike the World Trade Center and Pentagon were not the original commercial flights. They were substitutes, introduced into the airspace during the confusion of the morning's military exercises. But substitutes for what? If the original flights hadn't crashed into the buildings, what had happened to them? And what exactly had struck the towers? Her correspondence with Radar Ghost became increasingly cryptic as he realized the magnitude of what he had revealed. His final message was short and urgent. They know I've been talking. Moving the family tonight. The data you have is real, but is only part of the picture. Look for the fighter jets that weren't supposed to be there. Look for the electronic warfare signatures. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone who claims to be trying to help you. The people who did this have been cleaning up loose ends for 20 years. The account at Radar Ghost went dark after that message. When Mara tried to reach him through back-channel communications, she found that all his digital identities had been systematically erased. Email accounts closed, forum profiles deleted, encrypted messaging services showing no record of his user credentials. It was as if he had never existed. But the radar data remained, a digital fossil of a truth that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The morning of September 11th hadn't just been a terrorist attack, it had been the largest military deception operation in modern history, a shell game played with passenger aircraft while the world watched in horror. The question that now consumed Mara's every waking moment was simple and terrifying. If the planes that struck the buildings weren't the original flights, and if the original flights had been made to disappear somewhere over the American heartland, then who was responsible for the greatest aviation magic trick ever performed? And more importantly, what had happened to the 244 people who had been aboard those vanished aircraft. The scope of the deception was threatening to overwhelm her analytical capabilities. Aircraft substitution, media manipulation, academic intimidation. The threads were weaving together into a pattern so vast and complex that her rational mind struggled to process it. She needed something concrete, something that operated according to simpler rules than military operations or information warfare. She needed to follow the money. Financial markets were brutal in their honesty. Numbers didn't lie, couldn't be intimidated into silence, and left paper trails that were nearly impossible to completely erase. If someone had advanced knowledge of the attacks, they would have found ways to profit from that knowledge, and those profits would be traceable. Mara spent her remaining savings on access to premium financial databases and trading analysis software. She focused on the 3 trading days immediately preceding September 11th, 2001, looking for anomalies that screamed insider knowledge. The first anomaly was so blatant it seemed impossible that it hadn't been front-page news for months. Put options, essentially bets that a stock's price would fall, had spiked to unprecedented levels for American Airlines and United Airlines stock. The volume was not just unusual. It was statistically impossible without advanced knowledge. American Airlines put options had increased by 1,300%, above normal volume on September the 6th and 7th. United Airlines puts had spiked by 1,100% over the same period. Someone had wagered hundreds of millions of dollars that these 2 specific airlines, and only these 2 airlines, were about to experience catastrophic losses. But the betting wasn't limited to the airlines. Insurance companies had been targeted with similar precision. Marsh & McLennan, the insurance brokerage that occupied floors 93 to 100 of the North Tower, had been hit with massive put option purchases. So had Swiss Re and Munich Re, 2 reinsurance giants that would face billions in claims from the attacks. Even more specifically, put options had been purchased against Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and other financial firms that had major offices in the World Trade Center complex. The pattern was surgical. Only companies that would be directly impacted by the destruction of the towers were targeted for bearish betting. The profits from these trades, had they been collected, would have totaled over $2.5 billion. It was the most successful short-selling operation in financial history, predicated on advanced knowledge of one of the most devastating attacks in human history. Mara traced the trading orders through a labyrinth of financial intermediaries. The initial purchases had been placed through a network of small brokerages in Germany, Switzerland and Japan, locations chosen for their bank secrecy laws and regulatory opacity. But using advanced financial forensic software, she was able to peel back the layers of financial obfuscation. The ultimate source of funding led to a Russian bank called Seveny Trust, which intelligence analysts had identified as a clearinghouse for money laundering operations tied to former Soviet intelligence services. But even that wasn't the end of the trail. The most chilling discovery came when she traced what had happened to the profits. The put options had not been exercised. In the days following September 11th, when these trades would have generated enormous profits, they had been quietly abandoned. The traders had walked away from $2.5 billion rather than claim winnings that would have created an obvious money trail leading back to the conspiracy. But Mara's analysis revealed that equivalent amounts of money had simultaneously appeared in accounts tied to defence contractors and private military companies. Blackwater, Halliburton, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, corporations that would become the primary beneficiaries of the post-9/11 military-industrial complex, had received massive, mysterious capital injections in the weeks following the attacks. The money hadn't been collected as trading profits, which would have triggered regulatory investigations. Instead, it had been recycled through a complex network of shell corporations and offshore accounts, ultimately funding the very companies that would profit most from the subsequent war on terror. She cross-referenced this financial data with stock performance in the months following the attacks. Defence contractor stocks had exploded in value. Blackwater had grown from a small military training company to a billion-dollar private army. Halliburton had received no-bid contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The weapons manufacturers had seen their stock prices triple as America embarked on 2 decades of perpetual warfare. The pattern was inescapable. The same financial networks that had bet against the airlines and insurance companies had positioned themselves to profit enormously from the military response to the attacks. It was a perfect financial strategy. Short the targets, invest in the solution, then create the crisis that makes both positions profitable. But the most damning evidence came from an analysis of the timing. The put options hadn't just been purchased in the days before the attacks. They had been strategically timed to expire on September 21st, 2001, exactly 10 days after the attacks. This wasn't random speculation or lucky guessing. It was a precisely calibrated financial operation designed to maximize profits from advanced knowledge of a specific date. Mara sat back in her chair, the weight of the discovery crushing down on her. She had always imagined that if 9/11 was an inside job, it would be motivated by grand geopolitical strategy, ideological fanaticism, or the pursuit of imperial power. The reality was both more mundane and more horrifying. It was about money. The attacks weren't just a catalyst for reshaping global politics. They were the centerpiece of the most profitable investment strategy in human history. The towers had fallen, 3,000 people had died, and 2 decades of war had followed, all to execute a financial plan that had generated trillions of dollars for a small group of investors who had known exactly what was going to happen and when. She began mapping the ownership structures of the shell companies that had received the laundered profits. The network was vast and sophisticated, but patterns emerged. Many of the ultimate beneficiaries were names she recognized from business headlines. Defense industry executives, private equity firms specializing in military contractors, and investment funds that had emerged from nowhere in the early 2000s to become major players in the military-industrial complex. But one name kept appearing in her analysis, buried deep in the ownership structures and corporate boards: Meridian Group, a private investment firm that seemed to exist at the nexus of defense contracting, intelligence services, and international finance. Every financial thread she followed eventually led back to companies with Meridian connections. Meridian Group had been founded in 1999 by former intelligence officials and Wall Street executives. Its public portfolio focused on emerging security technologies and crisis management solutions. But Mara's research revealed that it also held controlling interests in companies across the entire 9/11 profit chain: the defense contractors who built the weapons, the private military companies who fought the wars, the surveillance technology firms who monitored the homeland, and the financial institutions that funded the entire operation. It was a vertically integrated conspiracy, a corporate structure designed to profit from every aspect of the post-9/11 world. And if her analysis was correct, the same people who had financed the attacks had then positioned themselves to profit from the response, creating a closed loop of violence and profit that had sustained itself for over 2 decades. The scope of the financial conspiracy was staggering, but it also provided something that the other evidence had lacked: concrete proof of premeditation. Markets might be manipulated, radar might be spoofed, and media might be controlled, but money trails were nearly impossible to completely obscure. The put options were smoking gun evidence that someone had known exactly what was going to happen on September 11th and had invested billions of dollars to profit from that knowledge. As she compiled her financial research into a comprehensive report, Mara realized she was no longer just investigating a terrorist attack. She was mapping the architecture of a shadow economy built on manufactured crisis, where the same people who created the problems also owned the companies that sold the solutions. The question was no longer whether 9/11 had been an inside job. The financial evidence made that undeniable. The question was how many other crises, how many other wars, how many other national emergencies had been manufactured by the same network of investors who had learned that terror was the most profitable business on Earth.